Deep beneath the bustling streets of modern Beirut, under layers of Roman, Greek, and Persian rubble, lies a mystery. It sleeps in the soil of the Levant, a sliver of land curving along the Mediterranean coast, a place whose name has echoed through history as both a promised land and a den of iniquity. For millennia, the people who lived here were known to us primarily through the eyes of their rivals, their enemies, and their conquerors. They are the Canaanites, a name that often conjures images of idolaters and antagonists from ancient texts, a people defined by their opposition to others. But archaeology, the patient science of dust and whispers, is telling a different story. It brushes away the biases of old scriptures and the propaganda of long-dead pharaohs to reveal a culture far more complex, innovative, and foundational than we ever imagined. The real mystery of the Canaanites isn't about their alleged wickedness. It's about piecing together the true story of their remarkable endurance and ingenuity, a story that begins not with a bang, but with the slow, steady rhythm of a farmer's footstep on fertile ground. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we settle in for our journey tonight, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always wonderful to imagine this story reaching out across the quiet corners of the world. Our story does not begin with a king or a conqueror, nor with a unified nation called Canaan, for such a thing never truly existed. It begins with the land itself, a narrow corridor of mountains, fertile valleys, and a sun-drenched coastline pressed between the colossal powers of Mesopotamia to the east and Egypt to the south. This geography was destiny. It was a land bridge, a conduit for armies, merchants, and ideas, making it a perpetual crossroads, a place of immense opportunity and constant peril. To understand the Canaanites is to understand that they were born in a place that could never truly know peace, a place where adaptation and cleverness were the essential tools for survival. Their tale is not one of empire, but of a mosaic of fiercely independent cities, each a tiny kingdom unto itself, all sharing a similar culture, but rarely a common cause. Long before the first walls were raised, before the first king was crowned, the story begins in the profound quiet of the Neolithic era. 10,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherers who roamed this land began a slow, revolutionary dance with nature. They began to settle, to coax life from the soil, domesticating wheat and barley, sheep and goats. This was the dawn of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, and the Levant was one of its cradles. Imagine the world through their eyes. Small villages of circular, semi-subterranean homes, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Life was governed by the sun and the seasons, a cycle of planting and harvest, of birth and death. There was an intimacy with the land, a knowledge of its every mood and secret. It was in communities like the one at Jericho, perhaps the oldest continuously inhabited town on earth, that the very idea of a permanent home began to take root. Its people building a massive stone wall and tower for reasons that still mystify archaeologists. A defense, a flood barrier, or perhaps a monument to a newfound sense of community. As centuries melted into millennia, these early farmers grew more sophisticated. The Chalcolithic, or Copper Age, saw the flicker of a new kind of fire, metallurgy. Somewhere around 4500 BCE, people discovered how to smelt copper, a discovery that seemed like pure magic. This wasn't just about making better tools, it was about specialized knowledge. For the first time, not everyone was a farmer. Some were miners, some were smiths, their hands stained with the green of oxidized copper. The Casulian culture, named after a site in modern-day Jordan, left behind stunning artifacts, intricate wall paintings, ivory figurines, and magnificent copper objects cast using the lost wax technique. This was a society growing in complexity, developing social hierarchies, and establishing trade routes to acquire the precious ores needed for their craft. A mystery still lingers around these early metallurgists. Was their advanced knowledge a local invention, or was it a technology that drifted in from the mountains of Anatolia or the Caucasus? Whatever its origin, it set the stage for the next great leap. This leap was the dawn of the early Bronze Age, around 3300 BCE. It was a period of profound change across the Near East, an urban revolution, and the land of Canaan was swept up in the current. The small villages of old began to swell, growing into fortified towns, and then into the first true cities. This wasn't a sudden event, but a gradual thickening of life, a concentration of people and power. The most obvious sign of this new era was the construction of massive defensive walls. These weren't the elegant precision-cut ramparts of later empires. They were colossal structures of mud brick and rough-hewn stone, sometimes several meters thick. The question, of course, is why? The walls suggest a world of increasing competition and danger. They speak of wealth, grain, livestock, copper tools that needed protecting from rival towns or nomadic raiders from the deserts beyond. Building such a wall required a level of social organization previously unknown, a leader to command, laborers to work, and a surplus of food to sustain them. The wall itself became the defining feature of the city, a clear line drawn between the organized, controlled world within and the wild, unpredictable world without. Inside these walls, a new kind of society was being forged. At the center of the city stood two crucial structures, the temple and the granary. The temple was the home of the local gods, the cosmic center of their world, managed by a new class of priests who mediated between humanity and the divine. The granary, often controlled by the temple or a nascent palace, was the economic heart of the city. It stored the surplus grain that was the true source of wealth, the currency that paid for soldiers, artisans, and public works. A ruling elite emerged, their power based on military prowess, religious authority, or control over this agricultural surplus. Life became stratified. You were a farmer tilling the fields outside the walls, an artisan crafting pottery within, a priest performing rituals, or a ruler making decisions. This city-state model, a collection of independent walled urban centers, each controlling its surrounding agricultural land, would become the quintessential political structure of Canaan for the next 2,000 years. It was a world of intense local loyalties, where your identity was tied not to a grand notion of being Canaanite, but to being a person from Megiddo, or Gezer, or Lachish. The seeds of a civilization, decentralized yet deeply interconnected, were being sown in the rich Levantine soil. This patchwork of burgeoning city-states, each nestled in its own valley, or perched on a strategic hill, drew its life not just from the grain in the fields, but from the very bones of the land itself. The geography of Canaan was a study in miniature diversity, a compressed world of dramatic and varied landscapes that shaped the destiny of its inhabitants. Along the coast stretched a fertile plain, kissed by the humid breezes of the Mediterranean, perfect for the intensive agriculture needed to feed a growing urban population. This was the region's breadbasket and its gateway to the wider world, where sandy shores offered natural harbors for the ships that would one day become the masters of the sea. Pushing inland, the terrain buckled and rose into a central spine of rugged hills and mountains. Life here was harder. The limestone slopes were better suited for the gnarled, patient roots of olive trees and grapevines than for sweeping fields of wheat. Yet these highlands offered sanctuary and a certain isolation, fostering a fiercely independent spirit among the people who terraced the hillsides and grazed their flocks in the scrubland. Further east still, the land fell away dramatically into the great Syrian African Rift Valley, a deep, almost otherworldly scar on the Earth's surface through which the Jordan River flows to the Dead Sea. This was a land of stark contrasts, of lush oases and barren salt flats. Beyond that lay the vast arid expanse of the desert, the domain of nomads, and a formidable barrier to the empires of Mesopotamia. Each of these zones, the coastal plain, the central highlands, the Rift Valley, and the desert fringe, fostered a different way of life, a different set of skills, and a different perspective. This environmental variety is key to understanding why Canaan never became a monolithic, centralized kingdom like Egypt. Instead, it remained a collection of micro-environments, each nurturing its own local powerhouse, its own distinct identity within a shared cultural tapestry. A man from the port city of Byblos, his hands smelling of salt and cedar, lived in a different world from a shepherd in the hills of Judea, whose life was dictated by the rhythm of his flock and the location of the next well. From the high peaks of the northern mountain ranges, especially Mount Lebanon and the Anti-Lebanon, came the region's most magnificent treasure, cedar. The famed cedars of Lebanon were more than just trees. They were titans of the ancient world, their aromatic reddish wood, a symbol of permanence and divinity. Growing straight and tall, some reaching 40 meters into the sky, their timber was light, strong, and incredibly resistant to rot and insects in the dry climate of the Near East. For the great civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, which were built primarily of mud brick and possessed little quality timber of their own, Canaanite cedar was the ultimate building material. From the very earliest dynasties, Egyptian pharaohs sent expeditions to the port of Byblos to trade for the massive logs needed to construct their sacred funeral barges, the doors of their temples, and the roofs of their palaces. The scent of Lebanese cedar filled the halls of power across the entire ancient world, a silent testament to the commercial reach of the Canaanite coastal cities. The control of this timber trade became a cornerstone of their wealth, the first great commodity that placed them at the center of international commerce. But it was a far humbler creature that would give the Canaanites their most enduring and famous brand identity. Living in the warm waters along the Mediterranean coast was a predatory sea snail, the murex. It was an unassuming animal, but it held a secret in a small gland within its body, a clear fluid that, when exposed to sunlight and air, underwent a miraculous transformation. This was the source of Tyrian purple, the most vibrant, precious, and color-fast dye known to the ancient world. The process of creating this dye was a masterpiece of early industrial chemistry, and a truly foul-smelling business. Fishermen would haul in thousands upon thousands of these snails, which were then broken open to extract the tiny gland. The collected glands were placed in large vats of salt water and left to putrefy under the heat of the sun for many days. The stench of these dye pits was legendary, a nauseating odor of rotting shellfish that would have clung to the very stones of the coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon. It was, quite literally, the smell of money. As the mixture fermented, it would slowly change color, moving through shades of pale yellow, green, and blue, until at last it blossomed into the deep, rich hue of purple-red. The woolen yarn steeped in this brew would emerge imbued with a color that would not fade, a permanent stain of staggering beauty. The sheer labor involved was immense. It took more than 10,000 snails to produce a single gram of dye, enough for perhaps the trim on a single robe. Consequently, its value was astronomical, at times worth more than its weight in gold. Purple became the color of kings, of emperors, of high priests. To wear a garment of true Tyrian purple was the ultimate expression of power and status, a luxury so profound that Roman law would eventually restrict its use to the emperor alone. The Canaanites and their later descendants, the Phoenicians, became the exclusive suppliers of this ultimate luxury good. They perfected and jealously guarded the secrets of its production, how to manipulate the process to create different shades, from violet to crimson, perhaps by using different species of snail, or by varying the exposure to light. This stinking, brilliant industry gave the land a name. The Greeks would call it Phoenicia, the land of purple, a name forever linked to the precious color extracted from the sea, a testament to a people who knew how to turn the muck and slime of the seafloor into the very fabric of royalty. Their world was built on the gifts of the land, the timeless strength of cedar, and the fleeting magical chemistry of a humble snail. The wealth flowing from the towering cedars and the odorous dye pits did not simply dissipate into the air. It coalesced and solidified, giving rise to the great urban centers that would dominate the Canaanite world for centuries. These were the crucibles where resources were transformed into power, the fortified hubs that managed the flow of goods and anchored communities to the land. The early Bronze Age saw these fledgling towns, which we glimpsed before, mature into true city-states, each with its own character, its own source of strength, and its own fiercely guarded independence. They were the jewels in the Canaanite mosaic, glittering with the profits of a truly international trade. Among the very oldest and most influential of these was the coastal city the Egyptians knew as Keben and the Hebrews as Gebal, but which history remembers best by its Greek name, Byblos. Situated on a sandstone cliff overlooking a small perfect harbor on the coast of modern Lebanon, Byblos was perfectly placed to become the capital of the ancient timber trade. Behind it, the majestic slopes of Mount Lebanon rose steeply, cloaked in the seemingly inexhaustible forests of cedar and fir that the pharaohs of Egypt so desperately coveted. The city became the primary port of call for Egyptian ships, a vital commercial outpost that linked the wealth of the Nile Valley with the resources of the Levant. This relationship was not a fleeting affair. It was an alliance of commerce and culture that endured for millennia, so ancient that its beginnings are lost in the mists of the late 4th millennium BCE. Archaeologists, digging through the layers of Byblos, have found a city saturated with Egyptian influence. Alabaster vessels bearing the names of Old Kingdom pharaohs, ceremonial axes, and fine jewelry from the Nile speak of a deep and continuous connection. It was a partnership of mutual necessity. Egypt needed wood for its ships, temples, and tombs, and Byblos grew fabulously wealthy by providing it. Walking through the streets of early Bronze Age, Byblos would have been an experience of burgeoning cosmopolitanism. The air would have been thick with the scent of cedar sap, salt spray, and the foreign spices of visiting merchants. The local tongue would have mingled with the sounds of Egyptian sailors haggling in the port. The city itself was protected by formidable stone walls, enclosing a dense network of houses, workshops, and grand public buildings. At its heart stood several temples, most notably the one dedicated to the city's patron goddess, Baalat Gebal, the Lady of Byblos. She was a powerful deity, a protector of the city and its mariners, and so closely associated with her Egyptian counterpart, Hathor, that their identities often blurred. The rulers of Byblos, buried in tombs that emulated Egyptian styles, presented themselves not as mere local chieftains, but as sophisticated players on the international stage. Byblos was a city that looked outward, its fortunes tied to the rhythms of the sea and the political stability of its great trading partner to the south. While Byblos fixed its gaze upon the sea, another great city, Megiddo, stood as a sentinel over the land. Perched on a commanding hill that rose above the fertile expanse of the Jezreel Valley, Megiddo's power came not from a harbor, but from its strategic control of the most important crossroads in the ancient Near East. It dominated the main pass through the Carmel Ridge, the route that all merchants and armies had to take when traveling between Egypt and Mesopotamia. This ancient highway, known to later civilizations as the Via Maris or the Way of the Sea, was the primary artery of international traffic, and Megiddo was the toll booth. To hold Megiddo was to hold the keys to the Levant. Its wealth was derived from the taxes it levied on caravans and the immense agricultural output of the valley it overlooked, one of the most fertile regions in all of Canaan. The early Bronze Age city at Megiddo was a place of immense spiritual and military significance. Its inhabitants constructed a truly astonishing sacred compound, dominated by an enormous circular stone altar, 7 meters in diameter and nearly 1.5 meters high. This open-air temple was a place of pilgrimage and large-scale ritual, its surface still showing the charred remains of animal sacrifices after 5,000 years. It was a clear statement that Megiddo was not just a fortress, but a major religious center for the entire region. Surrounding this sacred precinct and the city's well-ordered streets was one of the most impressive fortification systems of its time. The city was encased in a colossal stone wall, punctuated by a cleverly designed city gate with a bent axis entry, forcing any potential attackers to expose their flank as they tried to enter. This was the work of a powerful, centralized authority, a testament to the city's importance and the constant threat of conflict in a land of competing powers. The rise of cities like Byblos and Megiddo highlights the fundamental political structure of Canaan. This was a land of kings, but not of a kingdom. Each city was its own sovereign state, ruled by a local leader or malik, who likely combined the roles of military commander, chief judge, and high priest. One of the enduring mysteries of this early period is the precise nature of their power. Was the king an absolute autocrat, or did he rule in concert with a council of noble elders, a political institution we know existed in later periods? The archaeological evidence, with its focus on palaces and temples, tends to emphasize a single ruler, but the reality was likely more complex. These city-states were intensely jealous of their autonomy. They formed temporary alliances, fought bitter wars with their immediate neighbors over water rights and territory, and paid tribute to the great empires when necessary. They were the resilient, pragmatic nodes in a decentralized network, a culture of cities that had learned to thrive in the precarious space between the great powers that surrounded them. The vibrant, independent spirits of these city-states, from the bustling port of Byblos to the fortress of Megiddo, were constantly tempered by a colossal reality to their south. Like small planets orbiting a massive star, the Canaanite cities were caught in the immense gravitational pull of Egypt. The relationship was ancient, complex, and swung wildly between that of a valued trading partner and that of a subjugated vassal. The pharaohs, on their golden thrones along the Nile, viewed the Levant with a mixture of desire and disdain. It was a treasure chest of resources they needed, and a source of potential threats they had to control. For the kings of Canaan, managing this relationship was the single most important act of statecraft, a delicate dance of diplomacy, tribute, and occasional defiant rebellion. Their long history would be written in the ever-present and often suffocating shadow of Egypt. During Egypt's Old Kingdom, the era of the great pyramid builders, the connection was primarily commercial, driven by Egypt's insatiable appetite for the raw materials Canaan could provide. Remember the cedar trade that gave Byblos its wealth? That was the bedrock of the relationship. But it wasn't just timber. Canaanite ports also shipped high-quality wine, fragrant olive oil, and the vital resins and tars needed for the sacred art of mummification. In return, a river of Egyptian goods flowed north: fine linen, papyrus, intricate gold jewelry, and alabaster vessels that became prized possessions among the Canaanite elite. For a time, it was a partnership of mutual benefit. But the pharaohs, who considered themselves living gods, were not content to be mere customers. They saw themselves as the rightful masters of the known world, and their perception of their northern neighbors began to shift from one of clients to one of subjects. The first signs of this change appear in the boasts of Old Kingdom officials. An inscription from the reign of Pharaoh Pepithuin describes a series of military campaigns led by a general named Weni. He recounts leading a massive army of Egyptian soldiers and Nubian mercenaries against the Amu, the generic and somewhat dismissive Egyptian term for the Asiatic peoples of the Levant. Weni speaks of destroying their fortresses, cutting down their fig trees and vines, and carrying off captives by the tens of thousands. The language is brutal, intended to project an image of overwhelming Egyptian might. It's likely exaggerated, a piece of royal propaganda, but the message is clear. This was not about permanent conquest or occupation in the modern sense. Egypt was not setting up a provincial government. These were massive punitive raids, designed to punish any city-state that disrupted trade routes, to smash any emerging coalition of Canaanite kings that might pose a threat, and to remind everyone who was in charge. It was a policy of targeted intimidation, a way of ensuring the continued flow of resources by demonstrating the terrible cost of defiance. After the old kingdom collapsed into a century of internal strife, known as the First Intermediate Period, Egypt's shadow receded. With the central authority of the pharaoh gone, Egypt's ability to project power abroad vanished. For the Canaanite cities, this was a moment of opportunity, a breath of fresh air. Without the constant threat of Egyptian armies, they were free to develop on their own terms, to fight amongst themselves, and to expand their own trade networks without having to look over their shoulders. But this interlude could not last. When Egypt was reunified and reborn in the Middle Kingdom, it returned to Canaan with a renewed vigor and a far more sophisticated strategy of control. The pharaohs of the powerful 12th dynasty, rulers like Amenemhat and Senusret III, were not interested in simple smash-and-grab raids. They sought a more systematic and enduring form of domination. They constructed a massive series of fortifications across the eastern Nile Delta, a defensive line known as the Walls of the Ruler, designed specifically to control the movement of Asiatic peoples into Egypt. This was not just a military barrier. It was an instrument of state policy, filtering traders and migrants and blocking potential incursions. Beyond this wall, their influence in Canaan was felt more deeply than ever before. This new approach is revealed in one of the most curious and intriguing artifacts from ancient Egypt, the execration texts. These were ritual objects, typically pottery bowls or crude human figurines, upon which Egyptian scribes would write the names of foreign cities, tribes, and their rulers. They listed dozens of Canaanite towns, from Ashkelon on the coast to Shechem in the hill country. Once inscribed with these names, the objects were then ceremonially smashed, buried, or burned in a form of sympathetic magic. The ritual was intended to symbolically break the power of Egypt's potential enemies, to curse them and render them impotent. The great mystery of these texts is what they truly represent. Are they a literal hit list of rebellious vassals targeted for future campaigns? Are they a catalogue of known political entities in the region, a kind of intelligence report? Or are they a more generalized, almost paranoid ritual, meant to ward off any and all threats, real or imagined? Whatever their exact purpose, they give us a priceless glimpse into the Egyptian mindset, revealing a detailed awareness of the Canaanite political landscape and a deep-seated desire to control it through force, both real and magical. It was a form of psychological warfare, a constant reminder that even if the pharaoh's army was not at your gates, his priests were performing rituals in their temples to ensure your downfall. The shadow of Egypt was long, and it touched everyone. For centuries, the relationship had been predictable. A powerful, unified Egypt would project its strength northward, and the mosaic of Canaanite cities would bend, paying tribute and trading in its shadow. The rituals of the execration texts, with their magical shattering of Canaanite power, were a perfect symbol of this dynamic. But a kingdom, like a man, can fall ill. The glorious Middle Kingdom, weakened by a succession of short-lived pharaohs and perhaps internal decay, began to lose its grip. The central authority, based in the south of Egypt, faded, and its control over the bustling, multicultural Nile Delta grew weak. The shadow that had loomed so large for so long began to shrink, and into the growing light stepped the very people the Egyptians had sought to control, the Asiatics, the Canaanites. For a remarkable and controversial period, the great gravitational dance would be reversed. The planets would capture the star. This was not, as later Egyptian propaganda would claim, a sudden, brutal invasion of foreign hordes. The historical reality, whispered from the dust and pottery sherds of archaeology, tells a quieter, more complex story. The eastern Nile Delta had always been Egypt's window to the Levant, a melting pot where Egyptian culture met the traders, herders, and craftsmen who trickled in from Canaan and Syria. For generations, these Semitic-speaking peoples, the Amu, had been settling there, drawn by the wealth and stability of Egypt. They were a successful immigrant community, bringing with them their skills in metallurgy, shipbuilding, and commerce. As the central power of the 13th dynasty waned, these Canaanite communities, concentrated around their rapidly growing capital city of Avaris, simply filled the vacuum. It was less a foreign invasion and more of a gradual internal takeover, a political transition born from the slow decay of the old regime. The city of Avaris became a piece of the Levant transplanted onto the fertile mud of the Nile. Excavations there have revealed a city that looked utterly different from a traditional Egyptian capital like Thebes or Memphis. Instead of orderly Egyptian villas, archaeologists found Canaanite-style houses with central courtyards. Instead of grand temples to Amun-Ra, they found temples dedicated to the Canaanite storm god Baal, who was syncretized with the Egyptian god Set. The people buried their dead according to their own customs, interring them with Canaanite-style pottery, bronze weapons, and even donkeys, a practice completely alien to the Egyptians. Avaris was a bustling, cosmopolitan hub, the heart of a new dynasty of rulers from a Canaanite background, whom history would remember by the name Manetho, an Egyptian historian, gave them. The Hyksos, a term likely derived from the Egyptian Heka Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. These Hyksos kings of the 15th dynasty did not seek to destroy Egyptian culture. On the contrary, they adopted it. They took on the full titulary of the pharaoh, enclosing their Semitic names like Sakirhar, Kian, and Apepi in the royal Gattush. They styled themselves as the son of Ra and acted as patrons of Egyptian art and literature. Yet they never forgot where they came from. Their power base was in the Delta, and their foreign policy was focused on strengthening their ties with their kinsmen in Canaan and the wider Eastern Mediterranean. For about a century, from roughly 1650 to 1550 BCE, they created a vast commercial and political empire that stretched from southern Egypt through Canaan and Syria, connected by sea lanes to Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Minoan civilization on Crete. It was a golden age of international trade, administered not from Thebes, but from the bustling, Canaanite-flavored capital of Avaris. Of course, this is not how the Egyptians who lived through it, or rather, who wrote about it later, chose to remember it. For the native Egyptian kingdom that clung to power in the south, at Thebes, the Hyksos were an unbearable humiliation. Later texts, written by the victors, painted the Hyksos as a vile, impious race who had swept into Egypt, burning their cities, desecrating their temples, and enslaving their people. It was a powerful and effective piece of propaganda, designed to justify the long and bloody war of liberation that would eventually expel them, and to erase the national shame of being ruled by foreigners. But the Hyksos were not mere barbarians. In a twist of historical irony, these vile foreign rulers introduced to Egypt the very military technologies that would enable its future imperial glory. They brought new forms of bronze working, the powerful composite bow, and most revolutionary of all, the horse-drawn war chariot. This swift, mobile weapons platform would forever change the face of ancient warfare. The simmering resentment of the Theban princes in the south eventually boiled over into open war. The struggle began under King Sekenenre, whose horribly wounded mummy, with its skull cleaved by Asiatic-style battle axes, is a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting. The war was continued by his sons, Kamose, who campaigned deep into Hyksos territory, and finally Amos. It was Amose who, after a long and difficult siege, finally conquered the great city of Avaris. He drove the last of the Hyksos kings and their followers out of Egypt, pursuing them all the way to their fortress of Sharuhen in southern Canaan. With this victory, the foreign rule was broken, Egypt was reunified, and a new era was born. The new kingdom, the age of empire and legendary pharaohs. The Hyksos interlude was over, but it had changed everything. It shattered Egypt's sense of invincibility and instilled in its new leaders a fierce, almost xenophobic determination to never be humiliated again. They had learned the Hyksos' lessons well, mastering their weapons and their international ambitions. Egypt's shadow was about to return to Canaan, not as a mere raiding party, but as an imperial war machine bent on absolute conquest. The expulsion of the Hyksos and the birth of Egypt's militaristic new kingdom fundamentally rewrote the rules of the game in the Levant. The age of polite trade partnerships and occasional punitive raids was over. The pharaohs, now masters of the chariot and commanding a professional standing army, returned to Canaan not to secure a trade route, but to conquer and create an empire. From the north, another superpower was on the move. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, began pushing south, eager to claim the riches of Syria and Canaan for itself. The once independent Canaanite city-states were now trapped, the proverbial grass to be trampled by two fighting elephants. In this new, dangerous world of imperial competition, survival required immense cunning, flexibility, and wealth. While many cities struggled and were subjugated, one northern port city navigated these treacherous waters with such astonishing success that it entered a golden age. This was the magnificent city of Ugarit, located on the Syrian coast at a site now called Ras Shamra. Ugarit was blessed with a perfect geographic position. It possessed an excellent natural harbor known as Minet El Beda, or the White Harbor, which opened onto the Mediterranean Sea. More importantly, it was the western terminus of a major overland caravan route that stretched all the way to the Euphrates River and the great centers of Mesopotamia. Ugarit became the critical interchange, the grand central station of the late Bronze Age world. Goods flowing from every corner of civilization passed through its port and its warehouses. Great ships, likely similar to the one found wrecked at Uluburun off the coast of Turkey, would arrive laden with raw copper and fine pottery from Cyprus and the Mycenaean world. From the south came Egyptian grain, gold, and luxury goods. From the north, Hittite silver. These goods would be offloaded at Minet El Beda and exchanged for the cargo of donkey caravans that had plodded across the desert, carrying Mesopotamian textiles, tin, and lapis lazuli. Ugarit was the great mediator, the middleman, the Bronze Age equivalent of a global free trade zone, and its merchants grew fabulously wealthy by taking a cut of every transaction. This torrent of international trade created a society of breathtaking cosmopolitanism. To walk the streets of Ugarit in the 14th century BCE would be to immerse oneself in a sea of different cultures. The local Semitic language, Ugaritic, would have been the common tongue, but it would have mingled with the Akkadian of Mesopotamian traders, the Hurrian of merchants from the kingdom of Mitanni, the clipped speech of Hittite officials, the dialects of Cypriot sea captains, and perhaps even the early Greek of Mycenaean emissaries. Foreign merchants established their own communities within the city, creating a vibrant, multicultural environment where ideas were exchanged as freely as goods. The art and architecture of the city reflected this diversity, blending local Canaanite traditions with Egyptian, Aegean, and Anatolian motifs. It was a city that looked in all directions at once, its face turned to the sea, and its back open to the great continental empires. The heart of this thriving metropolis was the sprawling royal palace, a massive complex covering nearly 10,000 square meters. It was a labyrinth of over 90 rooms, multiple courtyards, and even an ornamental garden, all centered on a grand throne room where the king of Ugarit would hold court. But the palace was more than just a royal residence. It was the administrative and economic center of the kingdom. And it was here, within the palace and a nearby high priest's residence, that modern archaeologists made one of the most stunning discoveries of the 20th century. The city's archives. On thousands of baked clay tablets, the scribes of Ugarit recorded every facet of the city's life. There were meticulous administrative texts detailing tax payments, land grants, and trade inventories. There were legal documents, from marriage contracts to commercial disputes. And there was a trove of diplomatic correspondence, letters written in the wedge-shaped cuneiform script of Akkadian, the international language of the day, exchanged between the king of Ugarit and his powerful neighbors, the Pharaoh of Egypt and the great king of the Hittites. Most remarkably, the archives also functioned as a library, preserving the great literary and religious texts that formed the spiritual bedrock of their culture. It is here that we can finally hear the Canaanites tell their own stories, free from the hostile propaganda of their enemies. On these tablets are recorded the great epic myths, such as the cycle of the storm, god Baal, his dramatic battles against the tyrannical sea god Yam, and the voracious god of death, Mot. These tales of gods and goddesses, full of passion, conflict, and drama, reveal a worldview deeply connected to the violent but fertile cycles of nature. To read these texts is to understand their world, their fears of drought and chaos, and their hopes for the life-giving rains that Baal brought. This incredible intellectual output was the work of highly trained scribes who were not just clerks, but multilingual scholars. The scribal schools of Ugarit were among the finest in the ancient world. But amidst all this scholarship, they produced something truly revolutionary. While they used the complex Mesopotamian cuneiform for international letters, for their own language they devised and perfected a brilliantly simple alternative, an alphabetic cuneiform script. Using just 30 wedge-shaped signs, each representing a consonant, they created one of the world's first true alphabets. This was a radical simplification from the hundreds of signs one had to master to read Akkadian, a quantum leap in efficiency that put literacy within closer reach. It was the ultimate expression of Ugarit's genius, pragmatic, innovative, and built on a synthesis of old traditions and new ideas. The city thrived not just on wealth, but on knowledge, all while performing a constant, nerve-wracking diplomatic balancing act, pledging allegiance to the Hittites while trying to maintain its profitable ties with Egypt. A small kingdom of astounding brilliance, navigating the dangerous currents of an age of giants. The scribes of Ugarit, with their clever 30-sign cuneiform, had tasted the power of a simplified writing system. Their alphabetic script was a remarkable achievement, a testament to the innovative spirit that pulsed within their city. But even this was a halfway house, a brilliant idea still constrained by the old technology of pressing wedges into wet clay. At the very same time, a quieter and ultimately far more consequential revolution was unfolding elsewhere in the Canaanite world. It was a revolution not of kings or priests, but perhaps of miners, soldiers, and merchants. It was the birth of the linear alphabet, an invention so profound that it would fundamentally alter the course of human communication and empower the individual in a way that the grand monolithic scripts of the great empires never could. To understand the sheer genius of this invention, one must first appreciate the world it was born into. For nearly 2 millennia, writing had been the exclusive property of a tiny, highly trained elite. In Mesopotamia, scribes spent years mastering the intricate web of cuneiform, a system with hundreds of signs that could represent whole words, syllables, or serve as silent grammatical guides. It was a powerful but fantastically cumbersome tool. In Egypt, the situation was similar. The beautiful and complex hieroglyphic script, along with its cursive cousin, hieratic, was a universe of its own, a sacred code known only to the priests and bureaucrats who administered the pharaoh's realm. For an ordinary person, learning to read and write was about as likely as learning to command the sun and the moon. Literacy was not a skill. It was a profession, a form of state-controlled magic that kept knowledge and power locked away in the hands of the few. The Canaanite breakthrough was to throw away this entire rulebook. They looked at the baffling array of signs and symbols and asked a devastatingly simple question. What if a sign represented not a word and not a syllable, but a single individual sound? This was the alphabetic principle, and the key that unlocked it was a clever trick called acrophony. The idea was to take a picture of a common object and use it to represent the first sound in that object's name. In the West Semitic language spoken by the Canaanites, the word for an ox was alp, so a simplified drawing of an ox's head could stand for the initial guttural sound. The word for house, or bait, was represented by a simple square, which came to stand for the B sound. The word for water, mayim, became a wavy line representing the M sound, and so on. Suddenly, the entire complex soundscape of human speech could be captured with a small, manageable toolkit of around 22 signs. The birthplace of this astonishing idea appears to have been a place of hard labor and surprising cultural exchange. The Egyptian turquoise mines at Serabit el-Kadim, deep in the Sinai Peninsula. Here, around 1850 BCE, Egyptians oversaw mining expeditions staffed by Semitic-speaking workers from the Levant. On the rock faces of the mines, archaeologists discovered a series of crude, graffiti-like inscriptions. On one side are the elegant official hieroglyphs of the Egyptian overseers. But nearby are carvings in a different, much simpler script. This script, now called Proto-Sinaitic, is the first known version of our alphabet. The great historical mystery is who exactly carved them. Were they Canaanite laborers who saw the power of Egyptian writing but couldn't master its complexity? Did one anonymous genius, surrounded by the pictorial language of his Egyptian bosses, have a flash of insight and decide to borrow their pictures to write his own language? We will likely never know his name, but his invention was a gift to the world. This early alphabet was a grassroots technology spreading slowly and organically for centuries. We find traces of it, now called Proto-Canaanite, on scattered pottery shards and bronze daggers throughout the Levant. It was not yet the official script of any kingdom. It was the tool of merchants keeping track of inventory, of soldiers scratching their names onto their gear, of people on the margins of the great scribal traditions. The letters were not yet standardized. The ox's head might face left or right. The wavy line for water might be vertical or horizontal. But the underlying principle was sound, and it was spreading. It was the great seafaring Canaanite descendants, the Phoenicians, who would take this rustic invention and polish it into the sleek, efficient system that would conquer the world. Around 1050 BCE, from cities like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, they standardized the forms of the letters, making them more abstract and linear, easier to write quickly. They fixed the direction of writing from right to left and settled on a definitive set of 22 consonants. This was the Phoenician alphabet, a perfect tool for their vast mercantile empire. As they sailed the Mediterranean, establishing colonies and trading posts, they didn't just carry their purple dye and cedar wood, they carried their alphabet. The legacy of this Canaanite invention is simply our world. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician script, making the brilliant addition of dedicated signs for vowels, turning it into the first true alphabet for representing both consonants and vowels. The Etruscans in Italy learned it from the Greeks, and the Romans, in turn, learned it from the Etruscans, giving rise to the Latin alphabet that you are reading at this very moment. The Aramaic script, another direct descendant, became the ancestor of modern Hebrew and Arabic scripts. Every time you read a book, sign your name, or tap out a message on a screen, you are using the distant, refined echo of an idea born among Canaanite workers in a desert mine. A quiet revolution that truly gave a written voice to the world. The simple, elegant tool of the alphabet, born in the desert mines and polished in the coastal cities, allows us to read the very soul of the Canaanite people. For centuries, our understanding of their spiritual world was filtered through the hostile lens of their rivals, particularly the writers of the Hebrew Bible, who depicted Canaanite religion as a monolithic evil of idolatry and depravity. But thanks to the discovery of the great library at Ugarit, we can finally push past the propaganda and enter their sacred world on their own terms. The clay tablets unearthed from the ruins of the high priest's house tell us stories of the gods, not as demons, but as powerful, passionate, and deeply human-like figures whose dramas played out on a cosmic scale, reflecting the eternal cycles of the land itself. At the head of this sprawling and often dysfunctional divine family sits the patriarch El. His very name is the generic West Semitic word for God, signifying his primacy and ancient authority. In the myths from Ugarit, El is depicted as a venerable, wise, and somewhat remote figure, a celestial chairman of the board. His titles are grand and evocative: the Father of Years, the Creator of Creatures, and the King, he is imagined as a benevolent, grey-bearded old man who dwells in a tent at a mythical cosmic location, the source of the two rivers, in the midst of the fountains of the two deeps. It is here that the assembly of the gods convenes, and it is El who presides over their council. His assent is required for any great undertaking, yet he often seems weary of the day-to-day squabbles of his children. He is the ultimate source of authority, but his power is often exercised from a distance, leaving the more energetic, hands-on work of managing the universe to the younger generation of deities. By El's side is his consort, the great mother goddess Asherah. She is a figure of immense power and influence in her own right, bearing the title She Who Treads on the Sea. As the matriarch of the pantheon, she is the mother of the 70 gods who make up the divine family. In the myths, Asherah is no passive bystander. She is a savvy political operator in the celestial court, a powerful intercessor who knows how to navigate the moods of her husband, El, to get what she wants. When the young god Baal needs a palace built to cement his authority, it is Asherah who goes to El to plead his case, successfully persuading the old king to grant his permission. Her connection to fertility, wisdom, and the sea made her one of the most widely worshipped deities in the Levant, a fact that deeply troubled the prophets of ancient Israel, whose scriptures are filled with condemnations of the Asherah poles that were a central feature of her worship. While El may have been the official king, the undisputed dynamic hero and protagonist of the Ugaritic myths is the young storm god, Baal. His name simply means Lord or Master, but his true identity was Hadad, the god of rain, thunder, and the life-giving storm. He is the rider on the clouds, the divine warrior whose voice roars in the thunder and whose weapon flashes as lightning. In the arid landscape of the Near East, where life and death were dictated by the seasonal rains, Baal was the most vital and immediate of all the gods. He was the divine engine of fertility, the one who made the fields grow and the flocks multiply. The central epic discovered at Ugarit, the Baal cycle, is entirely dedicated to chronicling his rise to power. The story is a gripping cosmic drama. First, Baal must confront the chaotic and tyrannical god of the sea, Yam. Yam demands that the gods surrender Baal to him as a slave. But Baal, armed with magical weapons, rises to the challenge and utterly defeats the sea god, establishing order over the forces of chaos and earning the kingship of the gods. Yet his struggles are not over. He must then confront the most fearsome foe of all, Mot, the god of death, sterility, and the underworld, in a story that mirrors the brutal reality of the seasonal cycle. Mot invites Baal to his subterranean kingdom, and Baal, in an act of submission, descends and is swallowed by death. With his disappearance, the world withers. The life-giving rains cease, and the earth is scorched by the summer drought. It is then that his fierce sister, the virgin warrior goddess Anat, intervenes. Distraught with grief, she finds Mot, and in an act of shocking violence, she seizes him, splits him with a sword, winnows him in a sieve, burns him in a fire, and grinds him in a mill, scattering his remains over the fields. Through her brutal act of vengeance and a form of sympathetic magic, Baal is resurrected. He returns from the underworld, bringing the autumn rains, and life triumphs once more over death. This pantheon, with its remote father god and its active storm god hero, presents a fascinating historical puzzle. Does the Baal cycle describe a simple transfer of power from an aging king to his vigorous heir? Or does it reflect a real-world religious shift over many centuries, where the popular worship of the dynamic, relatable storm god gradually supplanted the more ancient and abstract cult of the creator god El? Whatever the case, the Canaanite spiritual world was not one of peaceful contemplation. It was a raw, earthy, and passionate reflection of their own lives, a world defined by the struggle for survival, the deep fear of drought and chaos, and the ecstatic joy of the returning rains, all governed by a family of gods who were as flawed, ambitious, and powerful as the natural forces they embodied. The epic tales of Baal's battles and El's cosmic decrees were the grand narrative of the Canaanite spiritual universe, the why that explained the turning of the seasons and the struggle for existence. But for the average farmer, sailor, or potter, these stories were the backdrop to a more immediate and practical question. How does one actually connect with these immense and often terrifying powers? How could a mortal human being earn the favor of the rider on the clouds or the creator of creatures? The answer lay in the tangible, earthly practices of religious life, in the sacred spaces, the solemn rituals, and the specialized personnel who formed the bridge between the human world and the divine assembly. This was a religion not just to be believed, but to be actively performed. The primary point of contact between mortals and gods was the temple. These were not merely places for communal prayer, but quite literally, the earthly houses of the deities. Archaeological excavations across the Levant, at sites like Hazor and Megiddo, have revealed the typical layout of these sacred structures. A visitor would first enter an open-air courtyard, a bustling space for public gatherings and the initial stages of ritual. From there, one would pass into a main hall, a more sacred room where offerings were presented. And at the very back, veiled in shadow and mystery, lay the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies. This was the god's private chamber, where a cult statue, beautifully crafted from wood and adorned with precious metals, would stand, embodying the divine presence. This tripartite layout, courtyard, hall, and inner sanctum, was a widespread Canaanite design that would later profoundly influence the architecture of the Israelite temples, including the famous Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Beyond the formal city temples, worship also took place at more rustic, open-air sanctuaries known as high places, or bamot. Often located on hilltops or in sacred groves, these sites were marked by standing stones, called masabot, which were thought to embody a divine presence or commemorate a sacred event. Alongside them would often be a wooden pool or a stylized tree representing the goddess Asherah and her life-giving maternal power. These high places offered a more direct and perhaps more intimate connection to the gods, away from the formal priesthood of the urban temples. They were places of deep, ancient sanctity, their origins stretching back to the very dawn of settled life in Canaan. The central act that took place in these sacred spaces was sacrifice. To the modern mind, the idea can seem bloody and primitive, but for the Canaanites, it was the primary language of communication with the divine. A sacrifice was not necessarily about appeasing an angry god. It was a gift, a tribute, a meal, and a transaction all in one. It was how you honored the gods, thanked them for blessings like a good harvest or the birth of a healthy child, and petitioned them for future favor. The most common form was animal sacrifice. A family would bring an unblemished lamb, goat, or for a truly important occasion, a bull, to the temple. A priest would perform the ritual slaughter, and the animal's blood, representing its life force, would be daubed on the altar. Part of the animal was then burned, its smoke and savory aroma rising to the heavens as the god's portion. The rest was divided, with a share going to the temple priests, and the largest part returned to the family for a joyous communal feast. It was a deeply social event that reaffirmed the bonds between the family, the community, and their divine protector. Of course, not all gifts were living creatures. People of lesser means would bring what they could: offerings of grain, loaves of bread, fine olive oil, or jars of wine. Small personal objects, like pottery vessels, carved figurines, and jewelry, were also left at the temple as votive offerings, tangible prayers left in the god's house. To answer life's pressing questions: should I embark on this sea voyage? Will my sick child recover? The Canaanites turned to divination. Priests served as diviners, experts in interpreting the will of the gods. One of the most popular methods, learned from Mesopotamia, was hepatoscopy, the practice of examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep. The liver was seen as the seat of life and emotion, and its unique markings, discolorations, and shape were read like a divine message. Archaeologists have even found clay models of sheep's livers at sites like Hazor, inscribed with cuneiform instructions, serving as textbooks for apprentice diviners. This brings us to the darkest and most controversial accusation leveled against the Canaanites: the practice of child sacrifice. The Hebrew Bible is unequivocal, condemning it as a horrific abomination performed for a god named Moloch. Later, Greek and Roman writers made the same claim about their descendants, the Punic people of Carthage. The archaeological evidence, however, presents a more complex and debated picture. In Carthage and other Punic colonies in North Africa, archaeologists have indeed found large cemeteries, called tophets, containing the cremated remains of thousands of infants and young children, seemingly confirming the practice in the Canaanite diaspora. But in the Canaanite homeland of the Levant during the Bronze and Iron Ages, the evidence is far more elusive. While some infant burials found in jars beneath the floors of houses have been interpreted by some as foundation sacrifices, most scholars now see them as tragic but ordinary deaths. To date, no undisputed tophet has ever been found in Canaan itself. This leaves us with a profound and unsettling mystery. Was this terrible ritual a rare, last resort practice reserved for times of catastrophic crisis, leaving little trace? Was it a later development primarily practiced by the Punic colonies? Or were the biblical and classical accounts a form of wartime propaganda, a vicious exaggeration designed to demonize an enemy? The truth remains buried, a stark reminder of how difficult it can be to separate the reality of the past from the polemics of those who wrote its history. The elaborate rituals and grand temples that anchored the Canaanite spiritual world were not sustained by faith alone. They were built and maintained by a much more worldly power, an unparalleled mastery of commerce. While their neighbors in Egypt and Mesopotamia built empires on the strength of their armies and the toil of their farmers, the Canaanites built a civilization founded on the art of the deal. Their greatest skill was not conquest, but connection. They were the master weavers of the ancient world, spinning a web of intricate trade routes by land and sea that stitched together the great Bronze Age empires into the first truly international economy. Their true genius lay in their ability to transform their precarious position at the world's crossroads from a liability into their greatest asset. Their commercial empire operated in two distinct but interconnected arenas. The first was the maritime world of the Mediterranean, which the Egyptians called the Great Green. From bustling ports like Ugarit, Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, sturdy single-masted ships set sail, their rounded hulls designed for cargo, not for speed. These were the workhorses of the Bronze Age, catching the wind in their great square sails, or, when the winds failed, being driven by the rhythmic pull of oarsmen. The routes were well-traveled. They sailed north along the coast to Anatolia to trade for silver and south to the Nile Delta, a constant and vital partner. But their most important route led west, a straight shot to the island of Cyprus, which they knew as Alatia, a land fantastically rich in the copper that was the essential ingredient for making bronze. From Cyprus, the routes spiderwebbed out across the sea, reaching Minoan Crete and the powerful Mycenaean citadels of Greece, creating a vibrant network of exchange that spanned the entire eastern Mediterranean. The second arena was the network of ancient overland trails that converged upon the Levant. These were the arteries of continental trade, plied not by ships, but by slow, steady caravans of donkeys. From the south, the legendary King's Highway brought the exotic luxuries of Arabia, aromatic frankincense and myrrh, essential for temple incense across the ancient world. From the east, across the vast Syrian desert, came caravans from the great cities of Mesopotamia, carrying fine textiles, tin from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, and precious lapis lazuli. The great inland Canaanite cities, like Megiddo and Hazor, grew rich by controlling these routes, serving as fortified caravanserai where traders could rest, restock, and pay their taxes. The Canaanites were the essential link, the only people who operated with equal skill in both the maritime and the continental spheres. For a long time, the sheer scale and complexity of this trade was difficult to grasp, known only from scattered texts and artifacts. But in 1982, off the coast of Uluburun in modern Turkey, a discovery was made that was like finding a perfectly preserved photograph of this lost world. Divers found the wreck of a late Bronze Age merchant ship, which had sunk around 1300 BCE. Its cargo, lying on the seabed for over 3,000 years, was a breathtaking time capsule of ancient commerce. The ship was carrying over 10 tons of raw copper, cast into large four-handled oxhide ingots for easy carrying, enough to equip a small army. With it was a ton of tin, the much rarer metal needed to alloy with the copper to create bronze. The ship was a floating foundry, a delivery of the very building blocks of the Bronze Age. But that was just the beginning. The ship's hold contained a veritable catalogue of the ancient world's treasures. There were over 150 Canaanite jars, a type of distinctive pointed-bottom amphora that was the era's go-to shipping container. Most were filled with terebinth resin, a key ingredient for making fragrant incense and perfume. Others likely held wine and olive oil. The manifest of this one ship is staggering. Logs of rare African ebony from Nubia, whole elephant tusks, and hippopotamus teeth for the ivory carvers, ostrich eggshells used as luxury containers, and ingots of raw blue and turquoise glass, a new and highly prized technology. There were manufactured goods from at least 7 different cultures, fine pottery from Mycenaean Greece and Cyprus, bronze tools and weapons, Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and even a golden scarab bearing the name of the famous Egyptian queen, Nefertiti. The Uluburun shipwreck reveals a system of trade far more sophisticated than simple barter. This was a highly organized, speculative commercial venture. The great mystery it presents is about the merchants themselves. Was this a royal trade mission dispatched by a king to acquire goods for the palace? Or was it a private enterprise, a freelance merchant captain carrying a mixed cargo on behalf of multiple investors? The sheer variety of the goods suggests the latter, hinting at a vibrant class of entrepreneurs who were willing to risk life and fortune on the high seas. These merchants operated in a world without modern insurance or navigation aids, a world of pirates and sudden storms. Yet they built a system of trust, credit, and contract that was robust enough to move vast quantities of wealth across immense distances. They traded not only in goods, but in ideas, styles, and technologies. Along these routes traveled the Canaanite alphabet, their most valuable export, a technology of communication that would change the world far more than any cargo of copper or tin. The magnificent cargo of the Uluburun shipwreck, with its treasures from 7 different cultures, paints a picture of a prosperous, interconnected, and relatively stable world. Such a complex system of international trade could only function under a cloak of imperial peace, a pax Aegyptiaca enforced by the might of the new kingdom pharaohs. But this stability was a fragile illusion, wholly dependent on the attention and competence of the rulers in their distant capitals. In the middle of the 14th century BCE, a shift occurred in Egypt so profound and bizarre that it caused the pharaoh to turn his gaze inward, neglecting his foreign empire with disastrous consequences. The story of this collapse is told to us not through grand monuments, but through a collection of desperate, whining, and wonderfully dramatic personal letters. A diplomatic archive that captures a portrait of an empire coming apart at the seams. This was the Amarna period, named after the modern site of Tel El Amarna, the location of a short-lived Egyptian capital built by the most controversial pharaoh in history. After centuries of ruling their Canaanite territories as a network of vassal states, demanding tribute and loyalty from local kings, the Egyptian system was well established. But then came Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who, in a fit of religious fervor, abandoned the entire pantheon of traditional Egyptian gods, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, and all the rest. He declared that there was only one true god, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun, and that he, the pharaoh, was its sole prophet. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and moved his entire government from the ancient capital of Thebes to a brand new, purpose-built city in the middle of the desert called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. This religious revolution consumed his every waking moment, leaving little time or energy for the petty squabbles of his Canaanite subjects. It is at Akhetaten that archaeologists in the 19th century unearthed a treasure trove, the state diplomatic archives, hundreds of baked clay tablets written in the flowing cuneiform script of Akkadian, the international language of the day. These are the Amarna letters, and they open a direct, unfiltered window into the political chaos of the time. The letters are primarily from the Canaanite vassal kings, and they follow a painfully predictable pattern. They begin with the most elaborate and comically obsequious salutations imaginable. A typical letter opens, "To the king, my lord, my god, my son, the sun from the sky. I am the dirt under your feet, the stool for your sandals. I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, my god, my son, 7 times and 7 times, on my stomach and on my back." After this mountain of flattery comes the inevitable but. "But my neighboring king is attacking me. But my city is about to fall. But the Pharaoh's governor is corrupt. But my trade caravans have been plundered." And always the same desperate plea: "Send soldiers, send gold, send help." The letters reveal a land in the grip of a political free-for-all. With the Egyptian policemen looking the other way, the local Canaanite kings were engaged in a ruthless game of thrones, constantly attacking each other, stealing towns and betraying alliances, all while loudly proclaiming their undying loyalty to the very pharaoh whose inaction was fueling the chaos. The most prolific and frankly pathetic of these correspondents was a man named Ribhada, the king of the ancient and important city of Byblos. He sent over 60 letters to Egypt, creating a running commentary of his own political demise. He was being systematically squeezed by a new power rising in the north, the kingdom of Amuru, led by an ambitious ruler named Abdi Ashirta and his even more cunning son, Aziru. Ribhada's letters grow more frantic with each passing season. He begs for just a small garrison of Egyptian troops to show the flag and deter his enemies. The pharaoh sends polite but non-committal replies. Ribhada reports that his allies are abandoning him, that his people are starving, that the enemy is at the very gates of Byblos. His final letters are shrieks of pure desperation, until, at last, the letters stop. The silence tells us all we need to know. Ribhada was overthrown and killed, a loyal vassal abandoned by his distant, preoccupied lord. Woven throughout these tales of betrayal is the constant mention of a mysterious and troublesome group of people called the Apiru or Habaru. The vassal kings blame them for everything. The Apiru are described as outlaws, mercenaries, rebels, and raiders who are destabilizing the entire region, sometimes working for one king, sometimes for another, sometimes just for themselves. The identity of these Apiru is one of the great, enduring mysteries of the Bronze Age. For a long time, scholars, noting the similarity between Apiru and Hebrew, theorized that these were the biblical Israelites during their conquest of Canaan. Today, however, most historians have abandoned this direct link, arguing instead that Apiru was not an ethnic term, but a social one, referring to a displaced, landless class of people, runaway serfs, political exiles, and adventurers who lived on the margins of society. They were not a unified people, but a symptom of the political breakdown of the era. A floating population of malcontents ready to sell their swords to the highest bidder in the chaotic world the Amarna letters reveal. This archive, born of a pharaoh's religious obsession, gives us a priceless ground-level view of a loyal province descending into a nest of vipers, its local rulers pleading for an intervention that would never come. The desperate, unanswered letters of men like Ribhada of Byblos were not just personal tragedies. They were symptoms of a geopolitical earthquake. An empire that cannot or will not protect its borders creates a vacuum. And in the ancient Near East, a power vacuum was an open invitation to the ambitious. As Akhenaten composed his hymns to the sun disk, a new and formidable power was watching from the north. patiently observing the chaos in Egypt's Canaanite provinces and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This was the Hittite Empire, a civilization of hardened warriors and shrewd diplomats from the high plateau of Anatolia, and they were about to bring the era of uncontested Egyptian dominance to a violent and dramatic end. The Hittites were a different kind of power from the Egyptians. Based in their rugged, heavily fortified capital of Hattusa, they were masters of the chariot and inheritors of a long Anatolian tradition of metallurgy. They were one of the first powers to begin working with iron, a technology that was still rare and precious, but which hinted at a future of harder, stronger weapons. Led by a series of brilliant and ruthless kings, they had consolidated their Anatolian heartland and were eager to expand south to control the vital trade routes that passed through Syria and Canaan, the very source of Egypt's imperial wealth. The architect of this southern expansion was King Suppiluliuma, a contemporary of Akhenaten and a man of boundless ambition. While the pharaoh was lost in his religious reveries, Suppiluliuma was on the march. He saw the infighting among the Egyptian vassals, as chronicled in the Amarna letters, not as chaos, but as opportunity. He advanced into northern Syria, a region Egypt considered its own, and began to pick off its vassal states one by one. The kingdom of Amuru, the same power that had squeezed Ribhada out of existence, wisely read the changing political winds and switched its allegiance from the distant, unresponsive pharaoh to the Hittite king, who was right on their doorstep. This was a catastrophic strategic loss for Egypt, a domino that led to the collapse of their entire northern defensive line. By the time Akhenaten's short-lived religious experiment ended and Egypt awoke from its inward-looking slumber, it found that half of its Asian empire had been stolen. This set the stage for one of the great superpower confrontations of the ancient world. The pharaohs of Egypt's new 19th dynasty, particularly Seti I and his famous son, Ramesses II, were military men through and through. Their entire foreign policy was dedicated to a single goal: restoring Egypt's honor and reclaiming the territories lost to the Hittites. Seti I led several successful campaigns into Canaan, re-establishing Egyptian control over the southern half of the region, but the Hittites were too entrenched in the north. The conflict was destined to culminate in a cataclysmic showdown between the two most powerful armies on earth. This showdown came in the year 1274 BCE, near the strategic and heavily fortified city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in modern Syria. On one side was the young, bold, and perhaps overconfident Pharaoh Ramesses II, leading an Egyptian army of 4 divisions. On the other was the Hittite great king Muwatalli II, who had gathered a massive coalition of his own troops and vassals. It was to be one of the largest chariot battles ever fought. The Hittites, masters of deception, sent out false spies who allowed themselves to be captured and, under interrogation, told Ramesses that the Hittite army was still far away. Believing them, Ramesses pushed his lead division ahead, becoming dangerously isolated from the rest of his army. It was a perfectly laid trap. As the Egyptian division set up camp outside Kadesh, the entire Hittite chariot force, which had been hiding behind the city, stormed across the river and crashed into the flank of the unprepared Egyptians. The attack was a complete shock, and the Egyptian division shattered and fled in panic. Ramesses himself was caught in the onslaught, his personal guard surrounded by thousands of Hittite chariots. In this desperate moment, As recorded in his own grandiloquent accounts, the young pharaoh prayed to the god Amun and single-handedly charged the enemy lines, cutting his way through the chaos. The reality is that he was saved by the chance arrival of a separate reinforcement column that appeared on the battlefield at the critical moment. The battle raged on, a bloody and inconclusive melee that left thousands dead on both sides. In the aftermath, both empires engaged in a furious propaganda campaign. Ramesses returned to Egypt and declared the Battle of Kadesh to be the greatest victory in history. He covered the walls of every major temple with colossal reliefs and inscriptions depicting his personal heroic triumph against overwhelming odds. The Hittite records, however, tell a different story. They note that the Egyptians failed to capture the city of Kadesh and were forced to retreat, leaving the Hittites in firm control of northern Syria. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. It was a bloody tactical draw, but a strategic victory for the Hittites, who had successfully halted the great Egyptian reconquest in its tracks. After decades more of low-level warfare and a continued stalemate, both aging empires realized that neither could ever fully destroy the other. Exhausted by the long war and facing new threats on other frontiers, they chose to do something unprecedented. Around the year 1258 BCE, Ramesses II and the new Hittite king, Hattusili III, negotiated the world's first surviving international peace treaty. Engraved on silver tablets, copies of which have been found in both Egypt and the Hittite capital, the treaty established a good peace and good brotherhood between us forever. They swore a pact of non-aggression, a defensive alliance against outside enemies, and formally recognized the borders of their respective empires. For the people of Canaan, this new reality was stark. Their land was now an officially partitioned frontier zone, with the southern cities paying tribute to Egypt and the northern cities answering to the Hittites. They were no longer the subjects of a single empire, but the inhabitants of a dense and permanent borderland, caught between the two great superpowers of their age. The Grand Peace Treaty, signed between the courts of Egypt and Hatti, carved on tablets of silver and celebrated with royal fanfare, brought a tense new order to the world of kings and empires. But for the vast majority of people living in the land of Canaan, this high-level diplomacy was a distant rumble of thunder. Their lives were not governed by the ambitions of pharaohs, but by the more immediate realities of the harvest, the marketplace, and the local lord who lived in the walled city on the hill. To truly understand this civilization, we must now turn our gaze away from the great international stage and zoom in, past the monumental gates and into the bustling streets and surrounding fields of a typical late Bronze Age Canaanite city-state. At the absolute apex of this small self-contained world was the king, or Malik. He was not a living god like the pharaoh, but a mortal ruler whose authority rested on a careful balance of military prowess, religious duty, and his ability to ensure the prosperity of his people. He was the chief warlord, expected to personally lead his chariot corps into battle to defend the city's lands. He was also the chief priest, the primary intermediary with the city's patron gods, responsible for performing the critical rituals that guaranteed their favor. His home, the palace, was the unquestioned center of the city's life, a sprawling complex that was part administrative headquarters, part fortress, and part luxury residence. Here, surrounded by his family and a court of officials, the king governed his small realm. This ruling class was dominated by a hereditary aristocracy of elite warriors known as the Marianu. These were the owners of the most decisive weapon on the Bronze Age battlefield, the war chariot. They were a privileged caste who held large estates granted to them by the king in exchange for their military service. They formed the king's council, advised him on matters of state, and feasted with him in the palace halls. Life for this elite was one of martial training, political maneuvering, and the enjoyment of luxury goods imported from across the sea. Fine Mycenaean wine vessels, Egyptian jewelry, and Cypriot bronze tableware. Below them was a small army of bureaucrats, the scribes who managed the state archives, the overseers who managed the royal granaries, and the tax collectors who were the bane of every farmer's existence. Step outside the palace grounds, and you would enter the vibrant, crowded, and noisy world of the city proper. The streets were narrow, unpaved, and winding, flanked by multi-story houses made of mud brick and stone, their flat roofs used for sleeping on hot summer nights. This was the domain of the merchants and artisans, the urban middle class who gave the city its economic vitality. The merchants were the city's window to the outside world, cosmopolitan figures who might speak several languages and who undertook dangerous, long-distance journeys by caravan or ship. They were the engine of the prosperity we saw in the Uluburun shipwreck, their activities bringing both wealth and exotic foreign ideas into the city walls. Working alongside them were the skilled artisans. In one district, you might find the potters, their wheels spinning out the distinctive torpedo-shaped Canaanite jars that were the standard shipping containers of the era. In another, the clang of hammers would signal the workshops of the bronzesmiths, forging the tools, weapons, and household items that were essential for daily life. There were weavers producing fine textiles, carpenters, and in the coastal cities, the famous ivory carvers, whose workshops turned out exquisite plaques and cosmetic boxes that blended Egyptian, Syrian, and Aegean artistic styles into a unique Canaanite hybrid. And of course, there were the dyers presiding over their foul-smelling vats to produce the fabulously expensive purple cloth that was the city's most prestigious export. But all of this urban life rested on the shoulders of the largest and most important segment of the population, the farmers. The vast majority of Canaanites did not live within the city walls, but in small rustic villages scattered across the surrounding agricultural lands. Their world was one of intense, back-breaking labor, dictated by the unyielding rhythm of the seasons. In the autumn, after the first rain softened the earth, they would plow their fields with teams of oxen. The winter was a time for tending to the olive groves and vineyards that dotted the hillsides. Late spring brought the frantic communal effort of the grain harvest, cutting the barley and wheat with bronze sickles. Their lives were precarious, entirely dependent on the favor of the storm god Baal to provide the rains, and a single season of drought could mean ruin. From their meager surplus, they had to pay a heavy tax in grain, wine, and oil to the king's storehouses. They were also subject to corvée duty, a form of labor tax that could call them away from their fields to work on state projects like strengthening the city's fortifications or building a new temple. In times of war, these farmers formed the bulk of the army's infantry, armed with simple spears and shields. When an enemy army, be it Egyptian, Hittite, or from a rival city-state, appeared on the horizon, their only hope was to gather their families and their livestock and flee to the safety of the great walled city that loomed over their lands, a constant symbol of both protection and authority. It was a stratified and often harsh world, but one where the farmer in the field, the artisan in his workshop, and the king in his palace were all bound together in a fragile, inescapable web of mutual dependency. Within the protective walls of the Canaanite city-states, in the labyrinthine streets, noisy with the sounds of daily life, was the domain of the artisan. We have seen their place in the social order, a vital urban class that gave the city its economic pulse. Now, let us step out of the abstract and into their workshops to run our hands, metaphorically, over the objects they created. The legacy of the Canaanites is not written only in their myths or their scattered diplomatic letters. It is baked into their pottery, forged in their bronze, and exquisitely carved into their ivories. These surviving artifacts are the tangible soul of their culture, speaking of a people who were simultaneously practical, deeply artistic, and connected to every major civilization of their day. The most common and fundamental of all their crafts was pottery. For every golden bowl in the king's palace, there were 10,000 simple clay vessels in the homes of his subjects. Most of what the potters produced was undecorated and strictly utilitarian. Sturdy cooking pots designed to withstand the heat of the fire, large storage jars for grain and olive oil, and simple plates and cups for the daily meal. Yet even in these humble objects, there is an elegance of form, a satisfying simplicity born of long tradition. The true genius of their mass production, however, was the famous Canaanite jar. As we have seen, this was no ordinary pot. With its pointed base for easy stacking in the holds of ships and its two prominent handles for lifting, it was the perfectly engineered shipping container of the Bronze Age. Produced by the tens of thousands in workshops up and down the coast, it was a standardized, branded product that carried Canaanite wine, oil, and resin to every corner of the Mediterranean world. While function often dictated form, Canaanite potters were also capable of creating beautiful decorative wares. In the Middle Bronze Age, they perfected a style known as chocolate on white, featuring intricate geometric patterns painted in a deep brown slip onto a pale background. Later, as trade with the Aegean world flourished, they began to import and admire the sophisticated pottery of the Mycenaeans and Cypriots. Soon, local Canaanite workshops began to imitate these foreign styles, not as mere copycats, but as creative adapters. They would take a popular Mycenaean form, like a stirrup jar, and decorate it with traditional Canaanite motifs, creating a unique hybrid product for a local market that had developed a taste for the international. If pottery was the foundation of daily life, metalwork was the backbone of the state's power. The Canaanite smith was a master of bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that defined the age. In smoky workshops filled with the heat of the furnace and the rhythmic clang of the hammer, these men produced the tools that fed and built their society. The tough bronze plowshares that tilled the fields and the sickles that harvested the grain. They also forged the weapons that defended the city: arrowheads, spear points, elegantly curved daggers, and the iconic Canaanite duckbill axe, a fearsome weapon with a long, narrow blade designed to pierce enemy armor. Beyond these practical items, they created delicate works of art. Small bronze statuettes of the gods, particularly the striding figure of the warrior god Baal, were common votive offerings. They were also masters of luxury metalwork, producing fine jewelry decorated with delicate patterns of tiny dots, granulation, and fine wires, filigree, and crafting ceremonial bowls and weapons inlaid with gold, silver, and electrum. The absolute pinnacle of Canaanite luxury craftsmanship, however, was ivory carving. Ivory, sourced from the tusks of Syrian elephants or imported from Africa via Egypt, was an exceptionally rare and expensive material, and its use was almost certainly controlled by the royal palace. The artisans who worked this precious material were in a class of their own, producing objects of breathtaking beauty and sophistication for the king and his court. They carved intricate cosmetic containers, combs, and handles for daggers and mirrors. Their most famous specialty was the decorative plaque, thin panels of carved ivory that were used to inlay fine wooden furniture, such as thrones, beds, and chests, turning them into dazzling works of art. It is in these ivory carvings that the true cosmopolitan nature of Canaanite culture is most beautifully expressed. The artists were masters of a unique international style, a seamless and creative blending of artistic traditions from every direction. A famous plaque found at Megiddo perfectly illustrates this. It shows a Canaanite king returning in triumph on his chariot, a scene familiar from Egyptian art. The king is presented with prisoners, and in a separate panel, he sits on a throne, celebrating with his queen. He holds a lotus flower, a classic Egyptian symbol, and is attended by servants, including a musician playing a lyre. The style of the carving, the clothing, the gestures, it is a masterful synthesis of Egyptian, Syrian, and Aegean influences, all woven together into a coherent whole that is distinctly Canaanite. The artisans were not just copying what they saw on imported goods. They were actively participating in a global conversation, selecting, adapting, and innovating to create a visual language that spoke of their unique position at the center of the world. Their art is a testament to a people who built their identity, not through isolation, but through connection. The exquisite ivory plaques of Megiddo and the sophisticated international trade that supplied their raw materials represent the Canaanite world at its zenith. The late Bronze Age was, for the elite at least, a golden era of cosmopolitan luxury, a time when a king in the Levant could sit on a throne decorated with African ivory, drink wine from a Mycenaean goblet, and communicate with his peers in a shared international script. This entire glittering superstructure, however, was built upon a complex and surprisingly fragile foundation. Like an intricate machine with many interdependent parts, the Bronze Age world system was vulnerable to shocks. Around the year 1250 BCE, a series of profound and interconnected crises began to develop across the eastern Mediterranean, a perfect storm of calamities that would stress this brilliant civilization to its breaking point. The first and perhaps most fundamental of these shocks was a dramatic shift in the climate. Scientific evidence gathered from ancient pollen, tree rings, and sediment cores reveals that the late 13th century BCE saw the onset of a severe, prolonged period of drought that gripped the entire region from Greece to Mesopotamia. This was no ordinary dry spell. It was a climatic event that lasted for decades, disrupting the monsoon patterns that brought winter rain to the Levant. The consequences were catastrophic. Year after year, the rains failed, the harvests withered in the fields, and the agricultural surplus that was the bedrock of the entire urban civilization began to evaporate. Widespread famine followed. We can hear the desperation in the official correspondence of the time. The great Hittite Empire, once a mighty conqueror, was reduced to begging its Egyptian rivals for emergency grain shipments to stave off mass starvation in its Anatolian heartland. For the ordinary Canaanite farmer, the situation would have been dire. As granaries emptied and food prices skyrocketed, malnutrition and disease would have become rampant. This environmental crisis created tens of thousands of desperate and displaced people, ancient climate refugees who had no choice but to abandon their barren lands in search of survival, putting immense pressure on the cities and destabilizing the delicate social order. This agricultural collapse had a direct and devastating impact on the intricate trade networks that were the lifeblood of cities like Ugarit. With little surplus grain, wine, or oil to export, and with their trading partners also in crisis, the entire commercial system began to seize up. The sea lanes of the Mediterranean, once protected by the navies of the great empires, became increasingly dangerous. Reports of piracy and coastal raiding grew more frequent. The secure environment that had made the voyage of the Uluburun ship both possible and profitable was vanishing. The flow of vital raw materials, especially the copper from Cyprus and the tin from afar that were needed to make bronze, became sporadic and unreliable. The industrial engine of the Bronze Age was beginning to sputter and fail. At the same time, the great imperial powers that had guaranteed the international order were themselves growing weak and distracted. The Hittite Empire was reeling from the famine and facing a growing military threat from the rising power of Assyria on its eastern flank. Egypt, under Pharaoh Meneptah, was forced to contend with a massive invasion of Libyan tribes and their allies from the western desert, a conflict that drained the treasury and diverted the army's attention. Within the Canaanite city-states themselves, the social fabric was tearing. The immense strain of the famine would have pushed the peasant population to the breaking point, fueling unrest, peasant revolts, and a flight from the land. More and more people likely fell outside the established system, joining the ranks of the lawless, wandering Apiru, becoming a ready source of manpower for any ambitious warlord seeking to disrupt the old order. The final panicked communications from the archives of Ugarit, written on clay tablets baked hard in the fires that would soon destroy the city, give us a chilling, real-time account of the world falling apart. In one letter, the king of Ugarit receives a terrifying report from one of his own officials. "The enemy ships are here. They have set fire to my towns and have done evil things in my country. My infantry and my chariots, where are they? They are in the Hittite country, and my ships are in the land of Lycia." Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. In another exchange, the king of Ugarit appeals to the nearby king of Alashia, Cyprus, for help, having spotted enemy ships at sea. The reply from Cyprus is grim and offers little comfort. "Be firm. Surround your cities with walls, and bring your troops and chariots into them, and wait for the enemy with a firm foot." This was a world on the edge of the abyss. The interconnectedness that had been the source of its strength was now the mechanism of its collapse, as crisis in one area cascaded through the entire system. The land was scorched by drought, the people were starving, the sea was full of predators, and the great empires were too weak or distracted to help. The storm was no longer on the horizon. Its first waves were crashing against the shore. The lights were about to go out all across the ancient world. The world of the late Bronze Age Canaanites, already weakened by drought, famine, and internal decay, was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. That spark did not come from the great empires or from an internal rebellion, but from the sea. Into this deeply troubled and fragile world sailed a mysterious and terrifying new force, a loose confederation of maritime warriors and migrating peoples who swept across the eastern Mediterranean like a tidal wave, leaving a trail of fire and ruin in their wake. The Egyptians, who faced them at the gates of their kingdom, gave them a collective name that has echoed through history with a sense of dread: the Sea Peoples. Their arrival was the final cataclysmic event that triggered the widespread and devastating collapse of the Bronze Age. The identity of the Sea Peoples is one of the most compelling and debated mysteries in all of ancient history. They were not a single nation or a unified ethnic group. The Egyptian inscriptions, particularly those of Pharaoh Ramesses III at his temple of Medinet Habu, list a whole coalition of different tribes who had joined forces. There were the Peleset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Sherdan, among others. Their precise origins are unknown, but scholars, piecing together clues from pottery, weapons, and linguistics, believe they hailed from across the central and eastern Mediterranean, from the Aegean, western Anatolia, Cyprus, and perhaps as far away as Sicily and Sardinia. They were likely the displaced populations of other collapsing civilizations, including Mycenaean Greeks fleeing their own burning citadels, and Anatolians escaping the implosion of the Hittite Empire, all caught up in a great migratory wave. The reliefs at Medinet Habu tell a crucial part of the story. They show the Sea People's warriors fighting on land alongside heavy, solid-wheeled ox carts, piled high with their women, children, and household goods. This was not a simple pirate raid. It was a mass migration, a desperate nation on the move, searching for a new home. Their path of destruction was swift and terrible. They seem to have first crashed into the coast of Anatolia, where their arrival coincided with the final violent obliteration of the Hittite Empire. The great capital of Hattusa was burned to the ground, and the Hittite state, which had stood as a superpower for centuries, vanished from the historical record, never to return. From there, the wave moved south. They overran the rich island of Cyprus, a vital source of Bronze Age copper, leaving its cities in ashes. Then they descended upon the Levantine coast, the heartland of the Canaanite civilization. The great cosmopolitan port of Ugarit, which had survived for centuries by playing the great powers against each other, was utterly destroyed by a sudden, violent attack from the sea. The last desperate letters we read from its archives were baked hard in the inferno that consumed the city, a poignant final testament to a civilization on the brink of extinction. Across Canaan, the archaeological record tells the same grim story. Major urban centers that had been continuously inhabited for 1,000 years or more show thick layers of fiery destruction dating to this period. The great cities of Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, and Ashkelon were all violently overthrown. The intricate palace-based economy, with its elite scribes, artisans, and international merchants, was wiped out. The complex, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age simply ceased to exist. The last bastion of the Old World was Egypt. Having smashed their way through Anatolia and the Levant, the Sea People's Confederation set its sights on the ultimate prize: the fertile, wealthy lands of the Nile Delta. Around the year 1111 BCE, Pharaoh Ramesses III mustered the full strength of his kingdom to face the onslaught. It was a battle for survival, fought on two fronts. Ramesses confronted their land forces with their intimidating ox carts somewhere on the borders of Egypt and claimed a crushing victory. The more decisive battle, however, was fought on the water in the branching channels of the Nile Delta. The Egyptian reliefs show a chaotic scene as Egyptian marines, supported by archers lining the shore, used grappling hooks to drag the taller, heavier sea people's ships into the shallows, where they were systematically destroyed. Ramesses III saved Egypt from conquest and boasted of his monumental victory on his temple walls, claiming to have made the invaders non-existent. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The war was ruinously expensive and shattered the Egyptian army. In the chaos, Egypt lost control of what remained of its Asian empire in Canaan forever. The pharaoh had saved his own palace, but the world it had once dominated was gone. The Great Collapse was complete. The international trade routes were severed. The great empires were either destroyed or in terminal decline, and literacy and high culture plummeted across the region. For the Canaanite people, it was an apocalypse that brought their brilliant, cosmopolitan Bronze Age civilization to a definitive and violent end, leaving the survivors to build a new world from the smoking ruins. The term Bronze Age collapse can feel abstract, a bloodless phrase for a complex historical process. But for the people who lived through it, it was no abstraction. It was the terrifying shriek of an attacker in the night, the roar of a consuming fire, and the final choking breath of a civilization. To truly understand the cataclysm that the sea peoples and their fellow crises unleashed, we must walk through the silent ruins of the great Canaanite cities they destroyed. The science of archaeology becomes a form of forensic investigation here, allowing us to piece together the final violent moments of these once magnificent centers of culture and commerce. Let us first return to the jewel of the northern coast, the great port of Ugarit. We remember it as a city of unparalleled wealth and learning, a cosmopolitan hub whose libraries held the epic tales of Baal and whose merchants traded with the known world. The archaeological evidence for its end is stark and absolute. Across the entire site, a thick layer of ash, in some places a meter deep, tells the story of a single catastrophic fire. The grand royal palace, the temples, the luxurious private villas, all were consumed. The destruction was so sudden and unexpected that the city's inhabitants had no time to flee with their valuables. Archaeologists have found hoards of bronze tools and weapons hidden away by metalsmiths who never returned to claim them. In one ruined house, they unearthed a beautifully carved ivory pyxis, a type of cosmetic box left behind in the chaos. The city was not just conquered and reoccupied, it was annihilated, its name and location lost to history for over 3,000 years, until a farmer's plow accidentally struck a tomb in 1928. The greatest inland city of the Canaanite world was Hazor, a veritable superpower in its own right. Located in northern Canaan, it controlled the major trade routes from Syria and Mesopotamia. It was a sprawling, heavily fortified metropolis, consisting of a high acropolis for the palace and temples, and a vast, walled lower city that housed tens of thousands of people. The book of Joshua would later remember it as the head of all those kingdoms. Yet its end was just as violent as Ugarit's. The archaeological evidence from the final Bronze Age layer reveals a scene of methodical, intentional destruction. The monumental palace on the Acropolis, built with majestic cedar beams imported from Lebanon, was burned with such intensity that its thick mud brick walls were fired red like pottery. In the city's various temples, the sacred statues of the gods were found decapitated and deliberately smashed to pieces, a clear act of desecration. The entire city, both upper and lower, was put to the torch and utterly destroyed. The mystery of Hazor is a great whodunit of biblical archaeology. Who was responsible for this incredible destruction? The timing, around 1200 BCE, put several suspects in the frame. Was it a contingent of the Sea Peoples who had pushed inland from the coast? Was it an internal revolt, a bloody uprising of the oppressed peasant class against the ruling chariot-riding elite? Or, as the biblical narrative famously claims, was this the work of Joshua and the invading Israelite tribes who burned Hazor with fire? Archaeologists are still fiercely debating the evidence, but the crime scene itself is unambiguous. The greatest city in Canaan was brutally and systematically wiped from the face of the earth. Further south, in the rolling hills between the Judean mountains and the coast, lay the important city of Lachish. It served as a major stronghold and administrative center for the Egyptian Empire in Canaan. Its end was no less terrible. Excavations have revealed a massive destruction layer with clear evidence of a final desperate battle. The ground was littered with bronze arrowheads, and the charred skeletons of men, women, and children were found among the collapsed and burned buildings, a grim tableau of the city's last stand. The great Forsi Temple, an important cultic site just outside the city, was also destroyed. The fall of Lachish was a clear signal that Egyptian power in the region had completely evaporated, leaving its loyal vassals to their fate. Across the land, the story is the same. From the coast to the Jordan Valley, the great urban pillars of Canaanite civilization came crashing down. This was not a simple changing of the guard, where one king replaces another. This was a decapitation. The elite, who managed the complex systems of international trade, state administration, and high culture, were either killed or scattered. The scribal schools were extinguished, and the art of writing itself was nearly lost. The sophisticated, interconnected, and prosperous world of the late Bronze Age was gone. The survivors were left to pick their way through the smoking ruins and charred timbers of their fallen cities, facing a future that was poorer, more isolated, and far more dangerous than anything their ancestors had ever known. Out of the ashes of the great firestorm that swept across the eastern Mediterranean, a new and profoundly different world began to emerge. The apocalypse that ended the Bronze Age was not the end of history, but a violent, brutal reset. For the survivors in the land of Canaan, life was no longer defined by the gilded palaces, the bustling international ports, or the grand rivalries of distant empires. The generations that followed the collapse inhabited a poorer, smaller, and more fragmented landscape. This was the beginning of the Iron Age, an era of transformation born of necessity, a time when the remnants of the Canaanite people, along with new groups arriving in the land, began to regroup and build a new society from the ground up. The most immediate and dramatic change was the collapse of urban life. The great, fortified cities that had dominated the fertile plains and coastal regions for 2 millennia were now either completely abandoned ruins, like Ugarit, or tiny, impoverished squatter settlements huddled amongst the rubble of their former glory. The highly centralized palace-based economy, with its king, its Marianu chariot warriors, and its army of scribal bureaucrats, had vanished. The complex web of tribute and redistribution that had funneled agricultural wealth into the cities was torn apart. In its wake, a major demographic shift occurred. Archaeology reveals a dramatic increase in the number of small, unfortified villages in the central hill country, the mountainous spine of the land that had previously been only sparsely populated. These new highland communities were the frontier of the Iron Age. They were pioneers, settling new land and adapting to a harder way of life. The people who established these villages were likely a mix of refugees from the destroyed lowland cities, former pastoral nomads who found an opportunity to settle down in the now uncontested territory, and perhaps new groups moving into the region. They lived in small clusters of simple but sturdy homes, the most common design being the four-room house, or pillared house. This practical structure typically had a central space for sheltering livestock at night, with 3 or 4 adjacent rooms used for living, sleeping, and storage, often with a second story above. Life was organized not around a king, but around the extended family or clan. Society became more decentralized and likely more egalitarian, with village elders making decisions for the community. It was a world that had shrunk from one of international connections to one focused on the immediate concerns of the village and its surrounding fields. This societal simplification was mirrored in their material culture. The high arts of the Bronze Age disappeared. There were no more grand temples being built, no more exquisite ivory carvings, no more luxury goods imported from across the sea. The vibrant hybrid pottery styles were replaced by simpler, cruder, and more localized wares. Most significantly, the art of writing was almost entirely lost. The scribal schools had been extinguished in the fires of the great cities, and for a few centuries, the Levant plunged into a dark age of illiteracy, with the elegant alphabetic script surviving in only a few isolated pockets, waiting to be rediscovered. It was in this environment of scarcity and isolation that the technological shift that gives the era its name occurred. Iron had been known in the Bronze Age, but it was a rare, difficult-to-work metal, often more valuable than gold. Bronze was the material of choice, but the creation of bronze depended on that intricate international trade network, which had to bring copper from Cyprus and, most critically, tin from very distant sources in Anatolia or even Afghanistan. With that network shattered, tin became nearly impossible to acquire. Bronze production ground to a halt. Out of sheer necessity, smiths were forced to master the more difficult and temperamental art of smelting iron. Unlike tin, iron ore is relatively common and can be found locally throughout the Levant. The transition was slow, and early iron tools were often brittle and inferior to well-made bronze. But they had one overwhelming advantage. They could be made locally by anyone who had the fuel and the know-how. Iron was the technology of self-sufficiency. This gradual shift from a dependency on imported bronze to the production of local iron was a quiet but profound revolution that would rearm and re-equip the peoples of this new age. This was the crucible, a world of small villages, clan-based societies, and emerging iron technology, in which the famous peoples of the biblical narrative would be forged. While the central hill country of Canaan was being slowly repopulated by small communities of farmers and herders, a different story of survival and revival was unfolding along the coast. The great cataclysm that ended the Bronze Age had not been uniform in its destruction. While many of the great cities had been turned into smoking ruins, some of the ancient coastal strongholds, particularly those on defensible islands or well-protected headlands, managed to weather the storm. It was in these battered but unbroken city-states, most notably Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, that the direct heirs of the old Canaanite maritime culture regrouped, adapted, and eventually rose again to achieve a new and even more widespread era of prosperity. History would know these survivors by a new name, the Phoenicians. It is important to understand that Phoenician was not a name they used for themselves. It was an exonym, a label given to them by the Greeks, Phoenikes, which likely meant the purple people, a direct and envious reference to their continued mastery of the famous Tyrian purple dye. In their own language, they were still the people of Canaan, Canaanites, and in their daily lives, they would have identified themselves not as members of a nation, but by their home city. They were Tyrians, Sidonians, Biblians. They were not a new people, but rather a streamlined and rebranded continuation of the Canaanite civilization, the resilient branch that had not been snapped off in the storm. For the first few centuries after the collapse, during the so-called Dark Age, these coastal cities struggled just like everyone else. The old trade routes were gone, the seas were unsafe, and their former markets in Egypt and the Aegean were in ruins. But as the chaos subsided and a new, albeit poorer, world began to take shape, the Phoenicians recognized an unprecedented opportunity. The great naval powers of the Bronze Age, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, were all gone. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Mediterranean Sea was a vacuum, an open field with no dominant power. With their centuries of inherited seafaring knowledge and shipbuilding skills, the Canaanite survivors were perfectly positioned to fill that void. Around 1000 BCE, their ships began to venture out once more. These were new and improved vessels, like the Birame, propelled by two banks of oars, making them faster and more capable of defending themselves than their lumbering Bronze Age predecessors. They carried the traditional goods that had made their ancestors rich, the incomparable cedar of Lebanon, and the exquisitely dyed purple textiles that were still the ultimate symbol of royalty and power. But they were also on a quest for new resources, particularly metals. They sailed west, establishing a chain of small trading posts that served as secure anchorages and markets. They went first to Cyprus, then to the Aegean, and then pushed further into the unknown to Sicily, Sardinia, and the coast of North Africa. The true prize lay at the far western edge of the world, in a land the Bible calls Tarshish, the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. This land was fabulously rich in silver, a metal that was in high demand across the Near East. The Phoenicians established a permanent settlement there, Gadir, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and began to ship immense quantities of silver back east. They became the undisputed masters of the sea, the great merchants and metal brokers of the early Iron Age. The city of Tyre, built on a near impregnable offshore island, rose to become the leader of this commercial renaissance. Its king in the 10th century BCE, Hiram IV, was so wealthy and commanded such skilled artisans that he was sought out as an equal partner by the powerful new kings of Israel, David and Solomon. It was Hiram who famously supplied the master craftsmen and the great cedar and cypress logs needed to build the first temple in Jerusalem, a testament to the Phoenicians' renewed status as the premier architects and artisans of their time. Along with their cargo of wood, textiles, and metal, the Phoenician sailors carried their most important cultural export, the alphabet. It was this refined 22-character script, perfected in the coastal cities, that they used to keep their accounts and write their contracts. As they established trading posts across the Mediterranean, they introduced this revolutionary writing system to the peoples they encountered, including the Greeks, who would adapt it to create their own alphabet, which in turn became the ancestor of our own. They were the great disseminators of culture, the bridge that carried the innovations of the ancient Near East into the emerging world of classical Europe. In a remarkable historical mystery, the Greek historian Herodotus even recounts a story of a Phoenician crew sponsored by an Egyptian pharaoh that supposedly managed to circumnavigate the entire continent of Africa. While it cannot be proven, the very fact that the tale was told and considered plausible is a testament to their legendary reputation as the boldest and most accomplished explorers of their age. They were the Canaanites, who had looked upon the ashes of their world, and instead of despairing, had simply built better ships and sailed away to create a new one. While the Phoenician city-states on the northern coast represented the survival and continuation of Canaanite culture, the southern coast saw the arrival of a completely new and powerful group of players. The great storm of the Bronze Age collapse had not only destroyed the old world, but had also deposited new peoples on its shores. Among the most significant of these were the direct descendants of the Sea Peoples themselves, a group who, after being militarily defeated at the gates of Egypt, were allowed to settle along the fertile coastal plain of Canaan. We know them from the Hebrew Bible as the great antagonists of early Israel, the Philistines. Their identity is no great mystery. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu, which depict Ramesses III's great battle, name the most prominent group among the Sea Peoples as the Peliset. It is from this name that the words Philistine and much later Palestine are derived. Archaeology provides a clear and stunning confirmation of their foreign origins. When the Philistines first appear in the archaeological record, around 1175 BCE, they bring with them a material culture completely alien to Canaan. Their early pottery is the most telling fingerprint. It is a locally made but stylistically identical version of the pottery used in the Aegean world of the Mycenaean Greeks. This distinctive pottery, with its images of birds and fish, is so different from the local Canaanite wares that it allows archaeologists to map their settlement with incredible precision. Their Aegean roots are visible in other aspects of their lives as well. In the ruins of their cities, archaeologists have found unique buildings with a large central hearth, a feature typical of Mycenaean palaces, but unknown in Canaanite architecture. Even their diet was different. Analysis of animal bones from their settlements shows a remarkably high percentage of pig bones, indicating that pork was a regular part of their diet. This stands in stark contrast to their Canaanite and later Israelite neighbors in the hill country, for whom pork consumption was rare to non-existent. Having been repulsed from Egypt, these Peliset warriors and their families settled, likely with Egyptian permission, along the southwestern coastal plain, a region that would forever after bear their name. They conquered and rebuilt several of the old ruined Canaanite cities, establishing a powerful league of 5 city-states known as the Philistine Pentapolis: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Governed by a council of lords, known by the non-Semitic title Seranim, this confederation was politically unified and militarily formidable. For several centuries, they were the dominant power in southern Canaan. Part of their success was due to a technological and organizational advantage. They are credited with being among the first in the region to adopt iron technology on a wide scale, not just for tools, but for weapons. The famous biblical story of how the Philistines monopolized the craft of blacksmithing, forcing the Israelites to come to them to sharpen their plows and axes, reflects a genuine historical memory of a Philistine technological edge. Their military was well organized and well equipped, a lingering echo of the Sea People's armies that had toppled empires. The tradition of championed warfare, exemplified in the famous story of the giant Goliath of Gath, suggests a military ethos rooted in the heroic warrior culture of the Aegean. For the first few generations, the Philistines remained a culturally distinct enclave. They spoke their own language, of which only a few words have survived, and worshipped their own gods, like Dagon, who was likely a syncretism of a native Canaanite crane deity and their own chief god. However, over time, a process of acculturation took place. They were a minority, ruling over a much larger subjugated Canaanite population, and they gradually absorbed the culture of the land they now called home. Within a few centuries, they had abandoned their own language in favor of a local West Semitic dialect, similar to Hebrew and Phoenician. They adopted the Canaanite alphabetic script for their inscriptions. Their distinctive pottery styles slowly blended with local traditions until they became indistinguishable. The Philistines did not remain outsiders forever. They eventually became Canaanites, another thread woven into the complex tapestry of the Iron Age Levant. But for the crucial formative centuries of the early Iron Age, they were the powerful, technologically advanced, and culturally alien newcomers who presented the single greatest challenge to the other people who were trying to forge their own destiny in the hills just to the east: the Israelites. At the same time as the Phoenician sailors were rebuilding their mercantile networks on the coast, and the Philistine warlords were consolidating their power in the Pentapolis, a third and profoundly influential group was coalescing in the central hill country. These were the Israelites, and their story, as preserved in the Hebrew Bible, is one of the most powerful and enduring national origin narratives ever composed. While archaeology provides one set of clues about their emergence, the Israelites themselves told a very different and far more dramatic story, a theological epic of divine promises, miraculous deliverance, and a destined conquest of the land of Canaan. Their story does not begin in the chaos of the Iron Age, but centuries earlier, in the mists of the Bronze Age, with a single family. It starts with the patriarch Abraham, who is called by a single, powerful God, Yahweh, to leave his home in Mesopotamia and travel to the land of Canaan. There, he receives a covenant, a solemn promise, that this land will one day belong to his descendants. This divine land grant, passed down through his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, forms the eternal basis for the people's claim to the land. The 12 sons of Jacob become the symbolic ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. a unified family long before they are a nation. The narrative then takes a dramatic turn. A famine drives the Israelites to seek refuge in Egypt, where, under the guidance of Jacob's son Joseph, they initially prosper. But generations pass, and a new Pharaoh comes to power who did not know Joseph. The Israelites are enslaved, forced into brutal manual labor, building the great cities of Egypt. It is in this crucible of suffering that their national identity is forged. God hears their cries and raises up a leader, Moses, to demand their freedom. When the Pharaoh refuses, God unleashes the 10 plagues upon Egypt, a series of terrifying divine judgments culminating in the death of the firstborn. This finally breaks the Pharaoh's will, and the Israelites are allowed to leave in the Great Exodus. This event is the absolute centerpiece of their identity. The miraculous parting of the Red Sea, which allows the Israelites to escape and drowns the pursuing Egyptian army, is the ultimate demonstration of their God's power and his special relationship with them. He is not a local storm god like Baal, tied to a specific place. He is the Lord of all history, capable of defeating the greatest empire on earth to save his chosen people. After their escape, they travel to Mount Sinai, where God makes a covenant with the entire nation. He gives them the Torah, the law, a detailed moral, legal, and ritual code that sets them apart from all other peoples and defines their relationship with him. They are now no longer just a collection of tribes. They are a holy nation, bound to a single God by a sacred contract. After 40 years of wandering in the desert, this new nation arrives at the borders of Canaan, the land promised to their ancestor, Abraham. According to the book of Joshua, what follows is a swift, unified, and divinely commanded military conquest. Under Joshua's leadership, the Israelite tribes sweep into the land as a single army. The fortified cities of the Canaanites, beginning with the iconic fall of Jericho, collapse before them. The native Canaanites are depicted as morally corrupt idolaters whose time is up, and God commands the Israelites to show no mercy, to completely eradicate their presence from the promised land. Following a series of decisive battles, the land is subdued and then systematically divided among the 12 tribes of Israel. The book of Judges, however, which follows the book of Joshua, paints a rather different and more complicated picture. It describes a much longer and messier period of settlement. The conquest was not total. Many powerful Canaanite cities remained, and the Israelites lived in a state of constant, often localized, conflict and coexistence with their neighbors. The book relates a repeating cycle. The people of Israel forget their covenant and begin to worship the Canaanite gods, Baal and Asherah. As punishment, God allows a neighboring people, be they Canaanites, Philistines, or others, to oppress them. The Israelites cry out for deliverance, and God raises up a charismatic military hero, a judge like Deborah, Gideon, or Samson, to lead them to victory. This narrative suggests that the Israelite identity was forged over centuries of struggle, a long, difficult process of carving out a space for themselves in a hostile land while fighting a constant internal battle against the allure of Canaanite culture. This powerful, complex, and sometimes contradictory story is the Israelites' own account of their origins, a foundational text that would define them and shape the history of the world. The question that has fascinated historians for centuries is how this sacred narrative aligns with the silent, impartial testimony of the stones. We are now faced with two powerful, compelling, and profoundly different stories about the origins of Israel. On one hand, we have the biblical narrative, a rich and detailed epic of patriarchal promises, divine deliverance from Egypt, and a swift, holy war of conquest. On the other, we have the silent, impartial testimony of the soil, the material record of pottery, bones, and stones unearthed by archaeologists. For centuries, these two stories were assumed to be one and the same. The Bible was read as a literal historical textbook, and archaeology was used to prove its accuracy. But as the discipline of archaeology has matured, it has begun to tell its own story, one that challenges us to understand the biblical text in a new and more nuanced way. If the biblical account of a unified, sweeping military conquest, as described in the book of Joshua, were historically accurate, it should leave a distinct and unmistakable fingerprint in the archaeological record. We would expect to find a trail of destruction layers in Canaanite cities across the land, all dating to a very short period of time in the late 13th century BCE. We would also expect to see the sudden appearance of a new and distinct material culture brought by these Israelite invaders from outside the land. When we examine the ground, however, we find that neither of these expectations is met. As we saw earlier, many Canaanite cities were indeed violently destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. However, these destructions are not synchronized. They are scattered over a period of more than a century and were caused by a variety of factors, including the sea peoples and internal conflicts. There is no evidence of a single coordinated military campaign. Furthermore, when we look at specific, iconic stories of the conquest, the discrepancies become even starker. At Jericho, the site of Joshua's famous first victory, archaeology has revealed that there was no significant fortified city in existence at the time the Israelites would have arrived. The great walls of Jericho had collapsed, and the city had been abandoned centuries earlier. There were simply no walls for the trumpets to bring tumbling down. A similar problem exists at the site of Ai, the scene of another major victory in the biblical narrative. It too was a desolate ruin long before this period. Faced with this growing mountain of contradictory evidence, most modern historians and archaeologists have concluded that the story of a rapid, unified conquest from the outside cannot be read as a literal historical account. This has led to a search for alternative models that better fit the material evidence. One early theory was the peaceful infiltration model, which suggested that the Israelites were nomads who gradually settled in the highlands. Another was the peasant revolt model, which posited that the Israelites were not outsiders at all, but were native Canaanite peasants who rebelled against their oppressive urban overlords. Today, the scholarly consensus is a sophisticated synthesis of these ideas, often called the gradual emergence or social revolution model. This theory posits that the vast majority of the people who would eventually be known as Israel were, in fact, indigenous to Canaan. They were a mixed population of displaced lowland farmers, pastoral nomads, and other dispossessed groups who had migrated into the sparsely populated Central Hill Country during the general chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. This explains the most crucial piece of archaeological evidence. The material culture of the earliest Israelite villages, their pottery, their architecture, their tools, is not foreign. It is a direct continuation of the local Canaanite traditions of the Bronze Age. These settlers did not bring a new culture with them from Egypt. They used the one that was already there. According to this model, the Israelite identity was not an ethnic label they carried with them, but a new social and religious identity that they forged in the Highlands. It was a conscious and revolutionary rejection of the old, hierarchical, and polytheistic culture of the Canaanite city-states. Their new society was more egalitarian, organized around clans and tribes rather than kings. And their new ideology was centered on the worship of a single God, Yahweh, who had liberated the oppressed and demanded their exclusive loyalty. In a very real sense, the first Israelites were Canaanites who decided to stop being Canaanites. So what then do we make of the powerful biblical narrative? It is best understood not as a journalistic report of past events, but as a foundational myth and a theological history, likely composed centuries after the events it describes. During the later period of the Israelite monarchy, a powerful story was needed to unify the nation and explain its unique destiny. The epic of a miraculous escape from slavery, a special covenant with God, and a glorious conquest of a promised land served this purpose perfectly. It provided the nation with a shared heroic past and a divine justification for its existence. The story of the Exodus is a timeless testament to the power of God to liberate the oppressed, and the story of the conquest is a stark assertion of their right to the land. The Bible tells us a profound theological truth about who the Israelites understood themselves to be. Archaeology, in turn, tells us a complex historical truth about where they actually came from. For millennia, the name Canaanite has been a synonym for a vanquished people, a culture so thoroughly defeated and reviled that its only legacy was to serve as a cautionary tale in the sacred texts of its rivals. The biblical narrative, with its powerful moral and theological agenda, required a clear distinction between the righteous Israelites and the corrupt Canaanites they were commanded to displace. But the story written in the stones, in the clay tablets, and in the very structure of language itself tells a different tale. It reveals that the Canaanites did not truly vanish. Their political entities were shattered in the Bronze Age collapse. But their culture was so foundational, so innovative, and so deeply embedded in the Levant that it was absorbed, adapted, and transmitted by its successors, leaving an immense and often invisible legacy that endures to this day. The most profound and undeniable of all their gifts to the world is the alphabet. This was not the invention of a great empire, but the product of the Canaanite genius for synthesis and practicality. As we have seen, this revolutionary idea, representing a single sound with a single sign, democratized literacy and unshackled the written word from the exclusive domain of a tiny scribal elite. It was the Phoenician descendants of the Canaanites who perfected this system and, as they sailed the Mediterranean, exported it along with their cedar and purple dye. Nearly every major alphabetic script in use today, including the Latin alphabet used to write English, the Greek and Cyrillic alphabets, the Hebrew alphabet, and the Arabic alphabet, can trace its direct ancestry back to this single, brilliant Canaanite invention. It is the fundamental software on which much of human knowledge has been recorded for 3,000 years. Their linguistic legacy extends to the very language of the Bible itself. Biblical Hebrew is not a foreign tongue that arrived in Canaan. It is, in essence, a later dialect of the West Semitic language spoken by the Canaanites. An inhabitant of Bronze Age Ugarit would have found the language of the Israelite prophets familiar and largely intelligible. But the connection goes deeper than mere vocabulary and grammar. The great discovery at Ugarit revealed that the literary and poetic conventions of the Hebrew Bible are a direct inheritance from Canaanite tradition, the defining feature of biblical poetry, known as parallelism, where an idea is stated and then repeated or expanded in a second parallel line, is the dominant structure in the epic poems of Ugarit. Even the imagery used to describe the God of Israel, Yahweh, is often drawn from the poetic vocabulary once used for the Canaanite gods El and Baal. In the Psalms and prophetic books, Yahweh is called the rider on the clouds, a title that belongs exclusively to Baal in the Ugaritic texts. Descriptions of Yahweh's voice as thunder, his mastery over the chaotic sea, Yam, and his divine counsel are all themes and titles with deep roots in Canaanite mythology. The early Israelites used the language and literature of their ancestors to articulate their own revolutionary faith in a single, all-powerful God. They took the old wine and poured it into a new wineskin. The influence of their mythology also radiated westward. As Phoenician sailors established trading posts in the Aegean, they brought their stories with them. Clear echoes of Near Eastern and Canaanite myths can be found in early Greek mythology. The Greek goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite for example, is widely seen as a Western version of the Canaanite fertility goddess Astarte, a close relative of Asherah, whose cult likely reached Greece via the Phoenician-influenced island of Cyprus. The Greek succession myth, which describes the sky god Uranus being overthrown and castrated by his son Cronus, has stunning parallels with the earlier Hittite myth of Kumabi, which itself belongs to a shared Anatolian-Syrian world of stories that included the Canaanites. Even the physical layout of their sacred spaces left a lasting mark. As we have seen, the tripartite Canaanite temple, with its outer courtyard, main hall, and inner Holy of Holies, became the foundational blueprint for the most sacred building in ancient Israel, Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. The great mystery is why this profound legacy remained hidden for so long. The answer lies in the overwhelming success of the biblical narrative, which, for theological reasons, needed to portray Canaanite culture as something alien and corrupt to be rejected, not as a rich tradition to be built upon. It took the patient work of modern archaeology to lift the veil of this ancient polemic and reveal the deep foundational debt that the Israelites, and by extension, the entire Western world, owe to the creative, resilient, and enduring culture of the Canaanites. For most of history, the vibrant world of the Canaanites was known only through the distorting mirrors of its rivals. They were a people without a voice, a culture defined almost entirely by the condemnations in the Hebrew Bible and the brief dismissive mentions in Egyptian and Mesopotamian records. Their profound legacy, as we have seen, was an invisible one, a cultural DNA hidden within the languages and traditions of their successors. This all changed in the 20th century. A chance discovery by a Syrian farmer would lead to one of the most spectacular archaeological finds in history, an event that would give the Canaanites their voice back after 3 millennia of silence and completely rewrite our understanding of the ancient world. The story begins in the spring of 1928. on the Mediterranean coast of Syria, at a large mound known locally as Ras Shamura, meaning Fennel Hill. A peasant farmer was ploughing his field when his plowshare struck a heavy flat stone. When he and his fellow villagers lifted the slab, they found it was the roof of a collapsed tomb. Inside lay a trove of beautiful pottery, much of it clearly imported from Cyprus and the Aegean world of the Mycenaean Greeks. News of this significant find reached the French authorities who administered the region at the time, and the following year, a brilliant young archaeologist named Claude Schaeffer was sent to investigate. Schaeffer immediately recognized that the tomb was part of a larger cemetery belonging to a major unknown city buried beneath the mound. He began to excavate the dell itself, and what he found exceeded all expectations. Layer by layer, he and his team uncovered the remains of a magnificent Bronze Age metropolis. They unearthed the foundations of a massive, multi-room royal palace, two great temples dedicated to the gods Baal and Dagon, and the grand stone villas of the city's wealthy elite. The scale of the city and the luxury of the artifacts found within it proved that this was no provincial backwater. This had been a major center of power and commerce. But what was its name? The answer, and the city's greatest treasure, lay not in gold, but in clay. As the excavations continued, particularly in the ruins of the palace, and in what appeared to be the house of a high priest, the team began to find hundreds and then thousands of baked clay tablets covered in the familiar wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform script. Many of these tablets were written in Akkadian, the well-understood international language of diplomacy during the Bronze Age. These texts were a revelation, containing legal codes, real estate transactions, and diplomatic correspondence with the great kings of the Hittite Empire. And in one of these letters, the city was identified by name. This was the legendary lost port of Ugarit. Even more exciting, however, were the thousands of other tablets written in a completely unknown form of cuneiform. Unlike the complex Mesopotamian script with its hundreds of signs, this new script used only about 30 simple, elegant characters. Schaeffer had discovered a new language and a new writing system. The tablets were quickly published, and in one of the great intellectual detective stories of modern times, the code was cracked with astonishing speed. Within a year, a handful of brilliant European scholars, working independently, realized that the script was not syllabic but alphabetic, and that the language it recorded was a previously unknown Northwest Semitic tongue, a very ancient and close relative of Biblical Hebrew. The successful decipherment of the Ugaritic alphabet opened a direct portal into the mind of the Canaanite people. The contents of the tablets were a revolution. For the first time, scholars could read the sacred myths of the Canaanites in their own words. The epic cycles of Baal, the stories of the wise old god El, and the exploits of the fierce goddess Anat. This completely transformed the study of ancient religion, providing a rich, authentic counterpoint to the hostile descriptions in the Bible. The discovery provided the missing context for the Hebrew scriptures, revealing the deep well of Canaanite poetic language and religious ideas from which the biblical authors had drawn. Beyond the myths, the thousands of administrative texts provided an unprecedentedly detailed picture of the city's economy, its legal system, and its society. The rediscovery of Ugarit did more than just put a lost city back on the map. It resurrected an entire civilization from obscurity. The farmer's plough at Ras Shamra had not just unearthed a tomb, it had given a voice to a people who had been silent for 32 centuries. For more than a century, the patient work of archaeologists, linguists, and historians has allowed us to resurrect the lost world of the Canaanites. The discovery of Ugarit gave them back their voice, allowing us to read their myths and understand their society. The study of their art and artifacts allowed us to appreciate their sophisticated cosmopolitan culture. But in the 21st century, a revolutionary new science has forged the most intimate connection of all, a link not of clay or stone, but of flesh and blood. By sequencing the DNA from the very bones of the ancient Canaanites, we can now answer the final lingering question: what truly became of them? The science of archaeogenetics, or the study of ancient DNA, ADNA, is a modern miracle. It allows scientists to extract the fragile, degraded genetic code from the remains of people who lived and died thousands of years ago, and to reconstruct their entire genome. In the warm climate of the Near East, where DNA breaks down quickly, this is an exceptionally difficult task. But in 2017, a team of scientists accomplished a remarkable breakthrough. They successfully extracted and sequenced the full genomes of 5 individuals who had been buried in the great Canaanite city of Sidon nearly 4,000 years ago, during the height of the Bronze Age. With this ancient genetic blueprint in hand, the researchers set out to answer 2 fundamental questions. First, who were the Canaanites from a genetic perspective? The answer revealed a deep and ancient history in the Levant. Their DNA was a composite of 2 major ancestral groups: a foundational population of local Neolithic farmers who had inhabited the region for millennia, mixed with a later wave of migrants who arrived from the east, from the direction of the Caucasus or Iran, during the early Bronze Age. This genetic story matched the archaeological picture of cultural shifts and migrations perfectly. The second question, however, was the most profound. Did the Canaanite people survive? And if so, who are their modern descendants? To answer this, the scientists compared the ancient Canaanite genomes to those of 99 modern Lebanese individuals. The result was astonishing and unambiguous. The study concluded that over 90% of the genetic ancestry of the modern Lebanese population is derived directly from the ancient Canaanites. This discovery is a stunning confirmation of deep biological continuity across nearly 4,000 years of turbulent history. The people of Lebanon today are the direct descendants of the people who built the cities of Byblos and Sidon, who traded cedar with the pharaohs, and who first invented the alphabet. The successive waves of conquerors and migrants that swept over the Levant, the Sea Peoples, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Crusaders, all left their mark, contributing to the rich cultural and genetic tapestry of the region. But they never completely displaced the foundational Canaanite population. This scientific revelation provides the final conclusive chapter in the story of this remarkable people. For millennia, they were remembered as the villains of the Bible, a people who were supposedly wiped from the face of the earth. The archaeological discoveries at Ugarit proved their culture was sophisticated and foundational. The study of their language and literature showed how their ideas shaped the civilizations that followed. And now, genetics has shown us that the people themselves never truly left. Their legacy is not just an echo in our alphabet or in the poetry of the Psalms. It is a living, biological reality, carried in the DNA of the millions of people who still call the sun-drenched coast of the Levant their home. The long story of the Canaanites, which began with the first farmers in the hills of the Levant, which rose to the heights of urban civilization, and which endured the collapse of an entire world, has now come full circle. They are no longer a lost people, no longer a shadowy myth. Through the patient work of science, we can now see them for who they truly were: a creative, resilient, and enduring people whose ancient story continues, quietly and unbroken, into the present day.